Chapter 41. Hero spent much of the morning in the shadow of Northumberland House, interviewing the gang of young sweepers who worked Charing Cross. An irregular open space at the end of the Strand, where Whitechapel, Cockspur, and St. Martin's Lane all came together, the intersection was heavily travelled. All agreed it was a capital spot, with lots of gentlefolk passing to and fro. The problem was, there were simply too many of the lads for any of them to do well. She was talking to a tall, gangly redhead named Murphy when she became aware of the sensation of being watched. She glanced around, her gaze assessing the intersection's fenced-in bronze equestrian statue, the classical facade of the Royal Mews, the flock of ragged barefoot boys clutching brooms. She had never considered herself a fanciful woman, but the unsettling conviction remained. "Is that fella over there?" said Murphy when she glanced around for the third or fourth time. "Behind the dustman's cart, just outside the coaching hotel. There. He's been staring at you for a good long while." The dustman's cart rolled forward, and she could see him now. An unkempt scarecrow of a man with sunken eyes and scarred cheeks, and a madman's fatuous grin. Hero thrust her notebook into her reticule and paid the boy generously for his time. "Thank you." With one hand still in her reticule, she strode purposefully across the street toward Judd Foy. She half expected him to bolt, but he just stood there, grinning, while she walked up to him. "Why are you watching me?" she demanded. His mouth opened and his chest jerked as if he were laughing, only he made no sound. "Been watching you for days, I have. You only just noticed it. Saw you talking to the little girl in Holborn." "Why?" "Why?" he repeated, his eyes clouding as if the question confused him. "Why are you watching me?" "You can learn all kinds of interesting things about a person by watching them." "Follow me again," said Hero, "and I'll have you taken up by the constables." He gave another of those strange, soundless laughs. "If you see me." She started to turn away, but stopped when he added, "I noticed you got yourself a cat. Black cats are unlucky, you know." She pivoted slowly to face him again. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Time was, people'd drown a black cat. Or maybe—" She drew the brass-mounted muff pistol from her reticule and pointed it squarely between his eyes. "You'd best hope my cat is very long-lived, because if anything happens to him, anything, you're going to wish you died a hero's death on the battlefields of Europe. Do I make myself clear?" She was dimly aware of a whiskered man in an old-fashioned frock-coat who turned to stare at her open-mouthed. A dowager in a sedan chair let out a startled shriek. Foy held himself painfully still, his idiot's grin wiped from his vapid face. "You'd shoot a man over a cat? Without compunction?" "Mother of God, you're as mad as your husband." She shook her head. "The difference between Devlin and me is that he probably wouldn't actually shoot you. I would." She pointed the pistol's nozzle toward the sky and took a step back. "Stay away from my cat." Sebastian arrived back at Brook Street to find Hero seated on the steps of the terrace overlooking the parterred garden. She still wore her dove-grey carriage dress trimmed in the palest pink, but she'd taken off her plumed pink velvet hat and kid gloves and laid them, with her reticule, on the paving stones beside her. She held the black cat in her lap and was stroking him under the chin when Sebastian walked up to her. "The Member of Parliament from South Whitecliff tells me that my wife shot 3 men at Charing Cross this morning, but the baker's boy swears it was only 1. She buried her face in the cat's soft black fur. "You should know better than to believe everything you hear. I found Judd Foy watching me again. He threatened the cat. I suggested that neither activity was a good idea. But with great restraint, I did not shoot him." Sebastian moved her reticule so that he could sit beside her, and heard the heavy chink of her flintlock. "Was he impressed with your sincerity?" "I believe he was." He reached out to caress her cheek with the backs of his fingers. "I'm sorry." She raised her head and looked at him. "I may perhaps have overreacted." "I don't think so." She gave a soft chuckle, but her smile faded quickly. "I don't understand why he's doing this, what he wants." "Matt Tyson says he was kicked in the head by a mule." "Tyson? Tyson knows him?" Foy testified for the defense at Tyson's court-martial. He was a sergeant with Tyson's regiment, a rifleman. She flipped the cat onto his back so that she could rub his belly. "Jamie Knox was a rifleman, wasn't he?" "Different regiment." She looked up then, her gaze meeting his. "You think there are so many ex-riflemen in London that they don't know each other?" Jamie Knox was seated at a rear table in an eating-house off Houndsditch when Sebastian drew out the chair opposite him and sat down. "Please, do have a seat," said the tavern owner, cutting a slice of roast mutton. "I'm looking for an ex-rifleman named Judd Foy." Knox waved his fork in an expansive gesture that took in the simple wainscoted room with its closely crowded tables and chairs, its cheerfully glowing fire. "Don't see him here, do you?" "But you do know him." "I know lots of people. It's one of the hazards of running a tavern." Sebastian studied Knox's lean, high-boned face. The likeness between Sebastian and this man was startling. Both had the same deep-set golden eyes beneath straight, dark brows and similarly moulded lips. But it was the differences that intrigued Sebastian the most. In Knox's case, the nose inclined more towards the aquiline, and there was a faint cleft in his chin. Characteristics he inherited from his barmaid mother, Sebastian wondered, or from the unknown father both men probably shared. "You still all fired up about Eisler?" asked Knox, stabbing his fork into a potato. "I'm still looking into his death, yes." Knox chewed slowly, then swallowed. "What's it got to do with Foy?" "I don't know that it has anything to do with him, but the man has been menacing my wife." A faint gleam of amusement deepened the gold in the other man's eyes. "I heard about this morning's incident at Charing Cross." "Did you now?" Knox reached for his ale. "Foy's not right in his head. I heard he was kicked by a mule. That's the official story." Sebastian laid his forearms on the tabletop and leaned into them. "Care to elaborate?" Knox shrugged. "I heard he was found near the stables with his head bashed in. Could have been a mule. Could also have been a rifle butt." "Why would someone want to cave the man's head in?" "They say Foy had just testified at some officer's court-martial." "This was after Talavera?" Knox shrugged. "Could be. I've forgotten the details. The man isn't exactly one of my boon intimates. You did catch the part about him not being right in the head, didn't you? Do you know where I could find him?" Knox cut another slice of mutton, chewed and swallowed. Sebastian said, "You do know, don't you?" "If I did. Why would I tell you?" "I think Foy might be in danger." Knox huffed a soft laugh. "From Lord and Lady Devlin?" "No, from the man, or men, who killed Daniel Eisler." Knox pushed his plate away and reached for his ale. He wrapped both hands around the tankard, then simply sat silently staring at it. Sebastian waited. "I've heard he keeps a room at the Three Moons near St. Sepulchre in Holborn." Knox drained his tankard and pushed to his feet. "Don't make me regret telling you." Chapter 42. Judd Foy was coming down the inn's rickety back steps, his lips pursed in a tuneless whistle, when Sebastian reached out to clench his fist in the man's foul, tattered coat front and swing him around to slam his back against the near wall. "Here, here," bleated Foy, his hat tipping sideways, his watery eyes going wide. "What do you want to go and do that to me for?" Sebastian searched the man's mad, gaunt features for some ghost of the stout, brash sergeant who testified for the defence at Matt Tyson's court-martial 3 years before. But the man was so changed as to be virtually unrecognisable. "I have a problem with people menacing my wife." "Me? I didn't menace her. If anything, she menaced me. Shoved her little muff gun in my face, she did, and threatened to blow my head off." "You were following her, watching her." "I wouldn't hurt her. I swear I wouldn't." "You threatened her cat." "I don't like black cats. Ask anybody. They're bad luck. Harm a hair on that cat's body and I'll kill you." "Over a cat?" "Yes. And they say I'm touched in the head." "Tell me what happened to you after Talavera." Foy's face went slack with confusion. "What do you mean? How did you get hurt?" "Don't rightly know. They found me near the stables with my head stove in and bits of my skull poking out. Thought I was a goner, they did, but I fooled 'em, didn't I?" He closed his eyes and huffed his eerie, soundless laugh. "You don't remember what happened to you?" "I don't remember much of anything from before then." "You'd recently testified at a court-martial. Do you remember the name of the man on trial?" "Aye, that I do remember. It was Tyson, Lieutenant Matt Tyson." Sebastian released his hold on the man's ragged coat and took a step back. "When you told me you saw me coming out of his house, whose house did you mean?" Foy grabbed his battered hat as it started to slide down the wall. "That diamond merchant what lived in Fountain Lane. Can't remember his name now." "Eisler." Foy carefully replaced the hat on his head. "Aye, that was it. Daniel Eisler." "Why were you watching his house?" "He had something that belonged to me." "What?" The man's thin chest shuddered with his silent laughter. "What do you think?" He leaned forward as if whispering a secret, his breath foul. "Diamonds." "Eisler had your diamonds?" "He did." "How did he get them?" "Somebody sold them to him." "Define somebody." "Never give me my share, he didn't." "Who? Who never gave you your share?" "I can't remember." Sebastian studied the man's skeletally thin face, the gaunt beard-stubbled cheeks, and rainwater-grey eyes lit by an unearthly gleam, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time, just how much of the man's madness was real and how much was put on for effect. "You say you were watching Eisler's house on Monday." "I was." "Eisler was dead by then." "I know that." "Were you watching the house the evening before?" "I was." "Did you see who came in and out that evening?" "I did." "Tell me what you saw." "Why should I?" Sebastian took a menacing step toward him again. Foy threw up his hands and skittered sideways along the wall. "All right, all right." "Who did you see?" Sebastian demanded. Foy's tongue flicked out to wet his dry, cracked lips. "Well, first there was this gentleman." "Who?" "How would I know? Never seen him before." "How old?" Foy shrugged. 40, 50. Hard to tell sometimes, ain't it?" "What did he look like?" "You think I can remember?" "Tall, thin, short, fat?" A frown contorted the man's face. "Tallish, I think. Dressed dapper. I told you I don't exactly remember. I didn't pay him no mind. Why would I? How long did he stay? Not long. 10 minutes, maybe less. What time was this? About the time it was getting dark, I reckon. I didn't see him too good. Sebastian tamped down a welling of frustration. Who else did you see? Foy screwed up his face again in thought. I think the doxy come next. A woman? When did she come? Maybe an hour later. Do you remember what she looked like? Foy shook his head. It were dark by then. Can't see nobody in the dark. How did she arrive? Some gentleman brung her in a hackney. He waited in the carriage while she got down and went into the house. Then he drove off, and I didn't see him, so there ain't no use in asking me what he looked like. If you didn't see him, then how did you know he was a gentleman? Because I seen his outline on the window when he leaned forward. He had a dapper hat on. His hat? You know he was a gentleman by the silhouette of his hat? Aye. He had one of them folding two-corner jobs, like what the gentry wears to the opera. You mean a chapeau bras? You think I know what they're called? And then what happened? Foy twitched one thin, ragged shoulder. I dunno. I left not too long after that. You didn't see the woman come out again? No. Did you see anyone else hanging around while you were watching the house? No. It's nearly all warehouses and storerooms down there now, have you noticed? A tick had started up to the left of the man's mouth, the grainy, filth-encrusted skin twitching in tiny, uncontrollable spasms. Sebastian said, I think you're holding back on me, Foy. There's something you're not telling me. Foy stared at him with vacant, roomy eyes. It might have been impossible to tell how much of the man's madness was feigned, how much was acquired, and how much had always been there. But Sebastian did not make the mistake of believing the ex-soldier harmless. Madness was always dangerous, especially when coupled with brutal self-interest. Yet he suspected that Foy was outclassed in perhaps all but evil by those into whose orbit he had now drifted. Sebastian said, I don't know how much of what you're telling me is true, and how much is sheer, unadulterated balderdash. That's a right hurtful thing to say, it is. But I think you've stumbled into something you don't understand here. Something that could get you killed. Foy grinned, opening his eyes wide, and pursed his lips to push his breath out in a mocking sound. Ooh, think I should be scared, do you? I'm missing a chunk of my skull and a part of my brain, and I'm still here, ain't I? I reckon I'm a pretty hard fellow to kill. No one's hard to kill, said Sebastian, and left him standing at the base of the stairs, a skeletal figure clothed in tattered rags that hung like a shroud about the frame of a man long dead. Charles, Lord Jarvis, leaned back in his chair, his feet stretched out toward the hearth in his Carlton House chambers as he studied the man who stood before him. He found Bertram Lee Jones a slob of a man, big and unkempt, but full of bluster and self-importance, tinged, Jarvis suspected, with no small portion of vice. Jarvis lifted a pinch of snuff to one nostril and sniffed. I trust you understand your instructions. I do, my lord, but— Good. Jarvis closed his snuff-box with a snap. That will be all. But— Jarvis raised one eyebrow. Mr. Lee Jones's full cheeks darkened. He set his jaw, said, As you wish, my lord, and bowed himself out. Jarvis was gazing after him, a thoughtful frown on his face, when one of the ex-military men in Jarvis's employ appeared at the entrance, his dark, rain-splattered cloak swirling as he swung it from his shoulders. Jarvis smiled. "Ah, Archer. Come in and close the door. I have an assignment for you." Chapter 43. Although both men had already denied it, Sebastian suspected that the shadowy chapeau bras glimpsed by Foy through the windows of a hackney the night of the murder, in all likelihood, belonged to either Blair Beresford or Samuel Pearlman. He decided to start with the young Irish poet. It took a while, but Sebastian finally traced Beresford to the churchyard of a small 18th-century chapel that lay just to the northeast of Cavendish Square, where the young man was winding his way among the tombstones. Pausing between the arched lich gate, Sebastian watched as Beresford stood beside one of the newer monuments, removed his hat, and bowed his head in prayer. Beresford prayed silently for some minutes before replacing his hat and turning toward the street. Then he saw Sebastian and drew up, an angry flush mottling his cheeks. What? A man can't even pray over his own dead sister without being spied on. "You have a sister buried here," said Sebastian in surprise. "My younger sister, Elizabeth. Louisa invited her to London 2 years ago for the season. It was a dream come true for her. I'd never seen her so excited." A breeze rattled the yellowing leaves of the hawthorns in the churchyard and brought them the scent of damp earth and dying grass. "What happened?" "She died of a fever just 5 weeks after she arrived." "I'm sorry." A muscle jumped along the younger man's jaw, but he said nothing. Sebastian turned to leave. Beresford stopped him by saying, "I take it you wanted to speak to me about something." Sebastian shook his head. "It can wait for a more appropriate time." "Why? Out of respect for my sister?" "She's dead. If you've something to say to me, just say it." Sebastian squinted up at the chapel's awkward neoclassical facade. "I have a witness who says he saw a man in a hackney carriage drop a woman of the street at Isla's house an hour or so after sunset the night of the murder. A man wearing a chapeau bras." Beresford's face hardened in a way that made him look considerably older, and less gentle. "If you're asking if that man was I, the answer is no. I already told you that." "So you did. Then tell me this. When was the last time you saw Isla?" "The Saturday before he died." The readiness of the man's answer took Sebastian by surprise. "Was that the last time you provided him with a woman?" "As a matter of fact, no. I saw him here." "Here?" Sebastian wasn't certain he'd understood right. "At Portland Chapel?" "That's right." Sebastian stared out over the rows of greying, moss-covered tombstones. The chapel was less than a century old, and already the churchyard was filled to overflowing. He said, "When was this?" "Late Saturday afternoon." "What was he doing here?" "I didn't ask." "Did you speak to him?" "I did." "I hadn't intended to, but he approached me. Accused me of following him. If you ask me, he'd been drinking. He was talking wild, said he knew they were watching him. He even accused me of working for them. But when I asked who they were, he just started ranting about some Frenchman named Collot." "Jacques Collot?" asked Sebastian sharply. "What about Collot? I told you the old goat was obviously foxed. He was practically raving. Nothing he said made much sense. He said it was all Collot's fault." "What was Collot's fault?" Beresford shrugged. "I assumed he meant the fact that someone was watching him. I don't really know. I tell you, he was as drunk as a wheelbarrow." The wind gusted up again, scuttling dead leaves across the overgrown path and ruffling the younger man's soft golden curls. After a moment, Beresford said, "Look, I know you think I killed him, but I didn't. I'm not saying I didn't want to. To be frank, I even thought about it a few times, about how I could maybe do it. But I'm Too much of a coward to ever go through with something like that. His features twisted with what looked very much like self-loathing. I let that little piece of human excrement use me as a tool to satisfy his sick carnal urgings. He talked to me like I was filth, threatened me, and I took it, because I was too weak and afraid to do anything about it. Sometimes admitting that you've been weak takes more courage than walking into a man's house and putting a bullet in his chest. Beresford gave a mirthless laugh and shook his head. No. Then his features sharpened. What? Asked Sebastian, watching him. I was just remembering something else Eisler said, about that Frenchman, Collot. What about him? He said he had a big mouth. Darkness was just beginning to fall, the last of the light leaching from the sky as Sebastian walked the narrow streets and alleys of St. Giles looking for Jacques Collot. The reek of newly lit tallow candles and torches filled the air, mingling with the smell of roasting mutton and spilled ale and cheap gin. He tried the Pilgrim first, then a string of ale shops along Queen Street, then the tavern where he'd spotted the Frenchman in consultation with his 3 confederates. Nothing. He was passing the smoke-blackened ruins of what looked like an old coaching inn when a low, anxious voice hissed at him from out of the darkness. Psst! Sebastian turned to find Collot hovering in the shadows of the burned inn's scorched, refuse-filled arch. He had his hat brim pulled low over his forehead, and the collar of his greatcoat turned up, although it was not cold. "Why are you hiding in the shadows?" asked Sebastian, walking up to him, but not too close. "Why? Because I am nervous. Why do you think?" He cast a quick, harried glance around him. "Many people are looking for me, asking about me. Why are you stirring up trouble by looking for me again?" Sebastian stared through the arch at the abandoned yard beyond. It appeared deserted, its piles of blackened timbers and rubble standing quiet and still in the deepening darkness. "I wanted to talk to you. The last time you talked to me, you ripped my coat. See? Look here." He turned sideways to display a large rent down one shoulder. "My apologies," said Sebastian. "I want to know how you discovered that Eisler had in his possession a certain big blue diamond." "Why should I tell you, Give me one reason why I should tell you." "To save your coat?" Collot's wayward eye rolled sideways. "I am a man with many contacts. I hear many things. You can't say where I learn things." "I suspect you could say where." Sebastian showed his teeth in a smile. "If the alternative becomes unpleasant enough." "Monsieur!" Collot threw up his hands like a man warding off evil. "Surely this is unnecessary." "How did you discover Eisler had the diamond?" "He showed it to a woman I know, a putain. She told me." "A whore? Why would Eisler show a precious gem to a woman off the streets?" "Why? Because he was a sick salou, that is why." Collot hawked up a mouthful of phlegm and turned his head to spit. "You would not believe some of the things I could tell you." "Try me." But Collot only shook his head. Sebastian said, "How did Eisler find out you knew about the diamond?" "What makes you think that he did?" Sebastian smiled. "You're not the only one who hears things." Collot sniffed. "He knew because I wanted him to know. He cheated me, you see, in Amsterdam. It might have been 20 years ago, but Collot does not forget these things. I brought him my share of the gems from the Garde Meuble. We agreed on a price. Then after I handed them over, he paid me 1/3 of what he had promised. Said if I set up a squawk, he would tell the authorities I'd tried to rob him. He was a respected merchant. I was a known thief. What could I do? He said I was lucky he had given me anything at all for the jewels. I should have killed him right there." "Why didn't you?" Collot squared his shoulders with a strange kind of pride. "I am a thief, not a murderer." So what did you hope to accomplish by going to him now, after all these years? I told him I wanted the rest of the money he owed me, and that if he did not give it to me, I would tell the French he had the Diamant Bleu de la Couronne. Sebastian was aware of a burst of laughter from the throng of drunken men in the street behind him. The last of the light had vanished from the evening sky, leaving the narrow lane dark and windswept. And what did he say? The old bastard laughed at me. He laughed. Then his face changed, and suddenly he was shaking with rage. It was as if he had been possessed by a demon. He said, if I ever thought of breathing a word to Napoleon's agents, he would see me buried alive in an unmarked grave. Who talks like that, When was this? Friday. So what did you do? Collot rolled his shoulders in an expansive Gallic shrug. I told. Who? Who did you tell? Why, the agent of Napoleon, of course. Who else? Eisler did not think I would do it. He did not believe I would have the courage, but I did. He should never have said those things to me. Sebastian studied the Parisian thief's mobile, beard-shadowed face. Are you telling me that you know the identity of one of Napoleon's agents in London? Collot's elastic mouth curved into a grin. Like I said, I know things. So who is it? The old thief gave a deep, husky laugh. Believe me, you do not want to know. But I do. Collot shook his head, his smile still wide, his eyes sparkling with amusement. I could tell you it is someone you know. More than that, it is someone you trust. He laughed out loud. But I won't. Sebastian resisted the urge to grab the man and shake him. Tell me this. Were you handsomely compensated for your information? Collot's face fell. No, said Sebastian, watching him. Why not? They said they already knew. They said they had known for weeks. Sebastian was aware of a dark carriage being driven slowly up the street. He said, You do realize that they are probably the ones watching you. They killed Eisler, and now they're going to kill you. No. Yes. Tell me who they are. No. Collot started to back away, his head shaking from side to side, his wayward eye going wild. You are trying to get me killed. What do you take me for? He broke off, his expressive face going slack with shock as the explosive crack of a rifle echoed in the narrow street, and the front of his coat dissolved into a pulpy sheen. God damn it, swore Sebastian, barreling the crumpling Frenchman deep into the fetid protective darkness of the old archway. He caught the man's falling body beneath the arms, propping him upright so he wouldn't choke on his own blood. But it was already too late. He saw Collot's eyes roll back into his head, heard the rattle in his throat, felt the essence of his life ease away, leaving Sebastian holding a silent, empty husk that seemed to collapse and diminish before his eyes. Chapter 44. Some hours later, after a tense and unpleasant interlude with the local constabulary, Sebastian walked into Kat's dressing room at the Covent Garden Theatre. The curtain had just fallen. He was still covered in blood, and he wasn't in the best of moods. "Devlin," said Kat, starting up from her dressing table. "You're hurt?" She still wore the elaborate stomacher and velvet gown of her character, and he stopped her before she could get too close to him. "Careful. You'll ruin your costume. And I'm fine. It's not my blood." She drew back, her gaze on his face. "Whose is it?" "An old Parisian thief named Jacques Collot. He was one of the original gang who stole the French crown jewels from the Garde Meuble. He found out Daniel Eisler was handling the sale of Hope's diamond and tried to use his knowledge of the stone's origins to weasel money out of Eisler." "How?" "By threatening to tell Napoleon's agent where to find the French blue. Eisler made the mistake of laughing at him." "Collot went to the French?" "He did." She turned away to fiddle with the hairpins and combs scattered across the surface of her table. her heavy dark hair falling forward across her face as she asked, with what struck him as studied casualness, "And was he able to tell you the name of the person Napoleon has charged with the stone's recovery?" He kept his gaze on her half-averted profile. "No. He was killed before I could get it out of him. Shot, probably, by the same person who killed the young thief in the alley behind Isler's house Monday night." He waited for her to make some response. When she didn't, he said quietly, "Is it you, Kat? Are you working for the French in this?" She'd sworn she'd severed her association with the French well over a year ago now, but that had been before their lives and their future together had unravelled in a morass of long-buried secrets and Hendon's self-serving lies, before she married Russell Yates and Sebastian married the daughter of Charles Lord Jarvis, the man who'd sworn to see her die an ugly, painful death. She looked up, her eyes going wide, her mouth forming an O of surprise and hurt as she drew in a quick breath. "I can't believe you just asked me that." He looked into her beautiful, beloved face, saw the hurt that pinched her features, saw her eyes film. He said, "I'm sorry." She shook her head, blinking rapidly, as if she were fighting back tears. "I suppose I should be flattered that you still trust me enough to believe I'd give you an honest answer. Kat." He reached for her, but she pulled away. "No. Let me finish. My love of Ireland is unchanged. I would do anything to see her free of this murderous occupation. Anything, that is. Except go back on the pledge I made to you." He felt as if he'd just sliced open his own chest and torn out his heart. "I should never have doubted you." "No." To his surprise, she reached up to press her fingers to his lips. "People are dying. I can understand why you felt you needed to ask. I kept the truth of my association with the French a secret from you when I should not have, and that will always be between us. It's not good for a man and woman to keep things from each other. Secrets destroy trust, and without honesty and trust, love is just a shifting mirage." He took her hand in his, pressed his lips to her palm, then curled his fingers around hers. "My love for you was never a mirage." They stood face to face, nothing touching except their hands. He could feel the tiny shudders trembling through her, breathed in the familiar theatre scents of grease-paint and oranges, looked into the deep blue eyes that were so much like those of her father. He said, "Do you ever think what would have happened to us if you hadn't listened to Hendon all those years ago? If you had listened instead to your heart and married me when you were 17 and I was 21? I think of it all the time." He leaned his forehead against hers, drew in a deep breath. She said, "I did the right thing, Sebastian, for you and for me." "You can still say that, despite all that's happened?" "Yes. We would have destroyed each other had we wed. I couldn't have continued on the stage as Lady Devlin. Yet I would never have been accepted into society. So what would I have done instead? Sit home and embroider seat cushions? I'd have been miserable, and in the end I'd have made you miserable too." "We could have found a way," he insisted. Although, for the first time, he was aware of a whisper of doubt. Faint, but there. That night a new storm swept in from the north. A fierce wind rattled the limbs of the elms in the garden and sent dead leaves scuttling down the street. Hero could see streaks of lightning rending the sky, hear the patter of wind-driven rain against the window. She lay alone in her bed, her eyes on the tucked blue silk of the canopy overhead, her hands resting low on her belly, on the swelling of the child she had made with a man she'd barely known, but who was now her husband. She heard him come in when the storm was at its fiercest. But though she listened carefully, she didn't hear him mount the steps to the second floor. And so, after a time, she drew on her dressing gown and went in search of him. She found him in the dining room, beside the long windows overlooking the wind-savaged garden. He had his back to her and did not turn when she paused in the doorway. He'd stripped off his wet coat and waistcoat, and she could see the tense set of his shoulders through the fine cloth of his shirt. The air was damp and close with the smell of the rain and the tang of blood, and an elusive scent she realized suddenly was peeled oranges. And she knew the pain of a woman who has given her heart to a man who lost his own heart long ago to someone else. But all she said was, "I hope that's not your blood I smell." He turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. "It's not. Jacques Collot is dead. He was telling me about how he came to know Eisler had the blue diamond in his possession when someone put a bullet in his chest with a rifle." "You didn't see who did it?" "I was too busy trying not to get shot myself." Crossing to the table beside the dying fire, she poured a glass of brandy and went to hold it out to him. "Here." He took the glass from her, his fingers covering hers for a moment. He said, "There's something I must tell you." "Tell me later. You should come to bed. You're wet and cold." "No." He set the brandy aside and reached to draw her into his arms. "I've put it off too long already." She felt his hands slide down her back to rest on her hips, holding her, but not too close. He said, "I first fell in love with Kat Boleyn when she was 16, and I was just down from Oxford. Hendon grumbled about it, although if truth be told, I think he expected some such thing. It's not exactly unusual for a young man to have an opera dancer or an actress in keeping. What he didn't expect was that I'd want to spend the rest of my life with her. You don't need to tell me—" "No, please, hear me out. When I told him I'd asked Kat to marry me, he flew into a rage and swore I wouldn't see another penny from the estates until he was dead. I told him I didn't care." A sad smile touched his lips. The world well lost for love and all that. A flash of lightning lit up the room with a throbbing blue glow, chased by a rumble of thunder. She waited. After a moment he said, "What I didn't know was that Hendon went behind my back and saw Kat. He told her that such a marriage would ruin my life and offered her £20,000 if she would leave me. She threw him out of her rooms. But his words had had their effect. She decided that he was right, that if she truly loved me, then she'd let me go. For my sake. So she told me she had no intention of marrying a pauper, and since my father was standing firm on his threat to cut me off, she wanted nothing more to do with me." "Oh, Sebastian," Hero whispered, "how fiercely noble of her." He sucked in a deep breath that flared his nostrils. "That's when I bought my commission and left England. I wasn't exactly trying to get myself killed, but I wouldn't have minded terribly if it had happened. When I came back to London some 6 years later, I thought I'd managed to put it all behind me." "Until you saw her again," said Hero softly, although what she really wanted to say was, "Why? Why are you telling me this now?" He nodded. "Eventually I found out the truth about what had happened all those years ago, that she had lied to drive me away from her. I asked her again to marry me, but she still refused. She said nothing had really changed, that she loved me too much to allow me to ruin myself by marrying a woman off the stage. In my arrogance, I was convinced I could change her mind eventually, only then you discovered she was Hendon's daughter." She watched him reach for his drink and down half the glass in one long pull. The tension in the air was like an unnatural hum that had nothing to do with the storm. He said, "I knew that in all fairness I couldn't blame Hendon for the blood relationship between them. After all, He was the one who'd been trying to drive Cat and me apart for years. But it took me a long time to forgive him for the undisguised satisfaction he showed at finally achieving what he had worked so hard to accomplish. She started to say, "But if you've forgiven him, then why are you still estranged from him?" Only something in his face made her hold her peace. He drained his glass and went to pour himself another brandy, as if he felt the need to put some distance between them. He said, "And then, last May, I discovered that in December of 1781, Hendon sailed for America on a secret mission for the king." Hero stared at him. Jarvis had sailed on that mission, too. She tried to recall if she'd known the date of their sailing, if she knew when. He said, "I will turn 30 next month. I assume you can do the sums." She watched him set aside the brandy decanter, watched him carefully replace the stopper, and understood finally what he was trying to tell her. "Are you certain Hendon's not—" "Yes." He tried to deny it at first, but in the end he was forced to admit the truth. "Do you know who—" "No. My mother never said." He stared at her from across the length of the room. His mother, Hero knew, had disappeared at sea years ago when Devlin was still a child. Hero was suddenly aware of the fury of the storm, of the wind rattling the window panes in their frames and the rain pounding on the terrace paving. He said, "I would have told you before we married, had the circumstances been different. But as it was—" She said, "Jarvis knew. He was on that ship with your father. So he's always known." "Yes." And yet he hadn't told her. Why? She wondered. Aloud, she said, "And the Bishopsgate Tavern owner, Jamie Knox? Where does he fit in all this?" "I honestly don't know. He could conceivably be my half-brother, or a cousin, perhaps. I find it difficult to believe the resemblance between us is nothing more than a coincidence. Unfortunately, his own paternity is cloudy." When she remained silent, he said, "I will understand if this knowledge alters your opinion of me." "It hasn't lowered it, if that's what you mean." She drew a deep breath that shuddered in her chest. "Why now? Why did you decide to tell me this now?" "Because I realized I don't want this secret between us any more." She suddenly felt both humbled and oddly, buoyantly hopeful. "I've kept secrets from you," she said quietly. "You've kept your father's secrets. There is a difference." Then the full implications of what he'd told her struck her. "So Cat Boleyn is not your half-sister?" "No. And Hendon knew it all along, damn his hide. He knew it, and he kept it to himself because he realized he'd finally hit upon the one sure thing that would keep us apart. And that, Hero now realized, was what had caused this new, intractable estrangement between the two men. She said, "Hendon could have repudiated you years ago, but he didn't. It could only be because he cares for you, loves you, as a father. He did what he thought was right for you. Hendon did what he thought was right for the sincere name and the sincere bloodline. Nothing is more important to Hendon than fulfilling what he believes is owed to his heritage. Nothing." "But the cousin who stands behind you in succession—" "The distant cousin who would become Viscount Devlin in my stead is in reality a vicar's byblow. Whereas my mother was herself a sincere through her grandmother. So you see, sincere blood does flow in my veins, even if it didn't come from Hendon himself." "I think you do Hendon an injustice. Cat Boleyn is his daughter. If you had married her, then your child, your heir, would have been his own grandson." Devlin gave a soft, humourless laugh. "An actress's son as the future Earl of Hendon. Hendon would stop at little short of murder to prevent such an abomination from ever coming to pass." She turned to stare out the window at the storm-thrashed garden. "Yet, if Yates hangs for this murder, you could now marry Kat. If you weren't married to me." "Hero." He came to stand behind her. She was aware of his hands hovering for a moment over her shoulders without touching her. Then he turned her in his arms and drew her close. She felt his breath warm against her cheek, the beating of his heart against hers. He said, "I've loved Kat since I was 21. There was a time I'd have sworn I could never learn to love anyone again. But I was wrong." She touched her fingertips to his lips. "You don't need to tell me what you think I want to hear." He gave her a strange, crooked smile. "I hope it is what you want to hear, because I'm telling you how I feel." She said, "It's what I want to hear." He took her hand in his and pressed a kiss against her palm. "Rise up, my love, my fair one," he quoted softly, his features growing taut, his eyes half-lidded, intense. "And come away. For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone." A loud clap of thunder shook the room, and they laughed together. She wrapped her other hand around his, their fingers entwining. "The flowers appear on the earth," she whispered. "The time of the singing of birds is come, and the vines with the tender grape give good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." "I think you left out a couple of lines," he said, pressing her back against the wall so that he could get at the ties of her dressing gown. She brought up one bare leg to wrap around his hip and let it slide slowly, provocatively, down the hard length of his thigh. "I was in a hurry," she said, and caught his laugh with her kiss. Chapter 45. Friday, the 25th of September. Early the next morning, Hero walked into the dining room of Jarvis House in Grosvenor Square to find her father looking over a stack of reports while consuming a solitary breakfast. Wordlessly, she closed the door in the footman's face and leaned back against it. "This is ominous," said Jarvis, his gaze still fixed on the papers in his hand. She pushed away from the door and came to stand in front of him. "You knew Devlin was not Hendon's son, yet you chose not to tell me. Why?" He looked up, his face, as always, inscrutable. "Under the circumstances, I saw no point. Are you suggesting it would have altered your decision to marry had you known the details surrounding his birth?" "No, I didn't think so." He dropped the report he held beside his plate and leaned back in his chair. "So Devlin finally told you himself, did he?" "Yes." She pulled out the chair beside him and sat. "Devlin says he doesn't know who his father is. Do you?" "Unfortunately, no. Believe me, I have tried over the years to discover the man's identity. One never knows when such information might prove useful, but none of my attempts have thus far met with success." He templed his hands before him. "Did Devlin also tell you that his mother still lives?" "She what?" "Omitted that little detail, did he?" Jarvis reached for his snuff-box and calmly opened it with a flick of a finger. "Oh, yes, she's still quite alive, although, as it happens, he does not know where she is." Hero watched him lift a delicate pinch to one nostril. "But you do, don't you?" He inhaled sharply and smiled. "I think perhaps I shouldn't answer that question." Her gaze met his. "You just did." It occurred to Sebastian that the more he learned about Daniel Eisler, the more he found it a wonder that someone hadn't killed the nasty bastard years before. Eisler's life had been populated by an endless stream of desperate men and women upon whom he inflicted financial ruin, sexual degradation, and burning humiliation. Sebastian knew the names of some of his victims, but only some. The number of people who wished the man dead must have been beyond counting, and Sebastian had less than 24 hours to find the one who'd finally given in to his, or her, lethal urges. Both Blair Beresford and Jacques Collot had admitted wanting to kill the diamond merchant. Would someone who actually followed through on his murderous impulses admit to them? Sebastian didn't think so. But then he'd learned long ago the fallacy of assuming others shared his own nature. Yet he also found himself wondering, why now? After decades of successfully cheating, blackmailing, and exploiting those unfortunate enough to stumble into his web, why had Eisler finally paid the ultimate price for his greedy machinations? Had he simply misjudged the wrong man? Or had he fallen afoul of forces too powerful for him to control? Sebastian was seated at his breakfast table, pondering these questions, when a distant peal sounded at the front door. A moment later, Maury appeared to clear his throat and bow. "A gentleman to see you, my lord. Colonel Otto von Riedesel apologizes for the incivility of calling upon your lordship at this hour, but wishes to stress the importance of his errand." "Show him in, and bring him a tankard of ale." Sebastian glanced down at the black cat seated on the rug at his feet. "And you behave." Green eyes gleaming, the cat flicked its tail and looked vaguely evil. The colonel came in with a quick step that jangled the spurs at his boots and swirled the black cape he wore thrown over his shoulders. "Please, do not get up," he said. "My apologies for interrupting your repast." "May I offer you something, Colonel?" "Thank you, but no." He held his black shako beneath one arm. Raindrops quivered on the ends of his moustache and on the high blue collar of his black dolman. "I require only a moment of your time." "Please, sit down." "Thank you." Von Riedesel sat, bringing with him all the scents of a rainy morning mingled with the odour of warm horseflesh, as if he had only just come in from exercising his hack in the park. He smoothed the splayed fingers of one hand down over his face, wiping the moisture from his moustache. Then he hesitated, evidently at a loss as to how to begin. Sebastian said, "I take it you've heard of the death of Jacques Collot." Von Riedesel nodded, his normally ruddy cheeks pale. "You knew him?" "Me? No, but I knew of him. Hear of his involvement in the theft at the Garde Meuble." The man's voice was strained, his accent more pronounced than usual. "Why was he killed? Do you know?" "Presumably because someone was afraid that he might talk." The Brunswicker rested his forearms on the tabletop and leaned into them. "But what could he know?" "Well, he knew the late Duke once possessed a certain large blue diamond." "Sir!" Von Riedesel sat back sharply. "If you mean to suggest—" "That you had a reason to kill him?" "Well, you did, didn't you?" The Brunswicker surged to his feet. "I refuse to stay here and—" "Sit down," said Sebastian. "Since you're here, you might as well answer some of my questions. Unless, of course, you'd prefer that I address them to the princess." "I ought to call you out for this." Sebastian chewed and swallowed. "But you won't, because that would draw the attention of the public, not to mention the Prince Regent, precisely where you don't want it. Sit." The colonel sat. Sebastian cut another slice of ham. Daniel Eisler had a nasty habit of collecting damaging information about people, especially important, vulnerable people. He paused to glance over at the colonel, who sat staring rigidly ahead. It occurs to me that he could have discovered something Princess Caroline did not want publicly known. Something such as the details of the sale of her father's jewels, perhaps. Or was it proof of her extramarital dalliances? Whoever told you Eisler had damaging information about the princess was lying. Actually, you told me. Me? But I never— Otherwise, why are you here? New beads of moisture had appeared on the Brunswicker's full cheeks. Only this time it was sweat, not rain. Sebastian said, "Eisler wasn't your typical blackmailer. He liked to use his information to torment people or to bend them to his will. So, what did he want from the princess?" "I can't tell you that." "Did she give him what he wanted?" Von Riedesel pressed his lips into a thin, flat line, then nodded curtly. "Yes." Sebastian gave up on his breakfast and leaned back in his chair. "You've served and protected the Duke's daughter for more than a decade. I can't see you standing idly by while a nasty little diamond merchant threatened her." "You are suggesting what? That I went to his home Sunday night and put a bullet through him?" If the Brunswicker's face had been pale before, it was now suffused with colour. "As it happens, I spent last Sunday evening in the company of a woman of my acquaintance, and no, I have no intention of telling you her name." He pushed to his feet, the movement so violent the chair toppled over, startling the cat. "Good day to you, sir." He had almost reached the door when Sebastian said, "Tell me this. Did the prince know about Eisler's interest in his wife's affairs?" Von Riedesel paused at the door to look back at him. "No. But I'll tell you who did know." "Who?" A gleam of malicious triumph flashed in the Brunswicker's small brown eyes. Jarvis. Jarvis knew. Half an hour later, Sebastian was on the verge of leaving to make a formal call on his father-in-law when he received a message from Sir Henry Lovejoy. Judd Foy had been discovered sprawled against one of the tombstones in St. Anne's churchyard. Dead. Chapter 46. Sebastian found Sir Henry standing in the lee of the church's soot-stained red-brick walls, his shoulders hunched, and the collar of his greatcoat turned up against the morning drizzle. Judd Foy still lay sprawled where he had been discovered, half propped against a mossy tombstone, like a man who'd stretched out for a nap. Except that his eyes were wide and staring, and someone had bashed the side of his head into a bloody pulp. "Given your interest in the fellow, I thought you'd want to know," said Sir Henry when Sebastian walked up to him. "Who found him?" "The sexton. He tells us he heard a commotion late last night, but saw nothing when he went to investigate. It was only this morning he noticed the corpse." Sebastian went to hunker down beside the body. In death, Foy seemed to have shriveled to little more than a loose collection of rags drummed into the mud by the previous night's rain. After a moment's hesitation, he reached out to touch the dead man's sunken cheek. He was cold. Looking up, Sebastian squinted through the drizzle to where a couple of constables were working their way across the overgrown churchyard. "Have they found anything?" "Nothing, I'm afraid." Sir Henry paused. "I heard about last night's shooting in St. Giles. You weren't hurt?" Sebastian shook his head. "They weren't shooting at me." Sir Henry nodded to the dead man beside them. "Does this make any sense to you?" "None of it makes any sense to me." The magistrate frowned. "One wonders what he was doing in a churchyard. Meeting someone, perhaps? Surely a tavern would have been more suitable, not to mention warmer and drier. It would also have been more public. There is that." Sir Henry reached for his handkerchief and wiped his nose with a sniff. Sebastian said, "You'll be sending the body to Gibson?" The magistrate's eyes narrowed in a thoughtful frown, but all he said was, "Indeed. I've just dispatched one of the lads to the Mount Street deadhouse for a shell." Sebastian was pushing to his feet when something half hidden beneath the dead man's greasy, ragged coat caught his eye. He reached for it, and found himself holding a small leather pouch embossed with the stylized initials D.E. He'd seen the device before. It was Daniel Eisler's. Loosening the pouch's rawhide tie, he shook some half a dozen small stones into the palm of one hand, They winked up at him, somehow snatching a measure of light from the dreary, overcast day and turning it into a brilliant rainbow of fire. "What is it?" Lovejoy asked, leaning forward to see. "Diamonds," said Sebastian. "I think they're diamonds." After the men from the dead house had carried off what was left of Judd Foy toward Tower Hill, Sebastian bought Sir Henry a cup of hot chocolate from a coffee-house on Leicester Square. "Is Foy the ruffian I hear accosted Lady Devlin in Charing Cross yesterday?" asked Sir Henry, his hands wrapped around his steaming mug. His nose was red, and Sebastian noticed he kept sniffing. "Yes." The magistrate reached for his handkerchief. "Remarkable woman, her ladyship. Quite remarkable. Not to mention formidable. She didn't bash in Foy's head." Sir Henry's eyes widened above his handkerchief. "Good heavens, I hope you don't think I was suggesting any such thing." Sebastian smiled and shook his head. Then his smile faded. "I hear Yates is scheduled to stand trial tomorrow morning." "He is, yes. I'm told they're so confident of conviction that the keeper has already ordered the construction of the gallows for Monday morning." Sebastian took a sip of his coffee and practically scalded his tongue. "Perhaps the deaths of 2 men linked to the case will lead the authorities to reconsider. It might be, if we were dealing with anyone other than Bertram Lee Jones." Lovejoy touched his handkerchief to his nose again. "Although there's no denying Foy's possession of that pouch of diamonds is certainly suggestive." "I don't think Foy is our killer, but he might well have known who the killer was. The man was a pauper. How else could he have acquired those stones?" "I don't know," said Sebastian, but it was only a half-truth, because Sebastian could think of at least 2 plausible scenarios. One involved Napoleon's unknown agent. The other implicated Matt Tyson. Sebastian spent the next couple of hours talking to several veterans of the Peninsular War, including an organ grinder in Russell Square who'd lost a leg at Borossa, and a sergeant who lived in one of the almshouses founded by Benjamin Bloomsfield. By the time he reached Matt Tyson's lodgings in St. James's Street, the morning's rain had ended, and the low, heavy clouds were beginning to break up. A ragged, barefoot boy in a cut-down man's coat held together with string was busy sweeping the mud and manure from the crossing with a worn broom of bundled twigs lashed to a stick. Sebastian tipped him 2pence as he crossed the street, and watched the boy's eyes go wide. It shamed him to realize that before Hero had embarked on the research for her article, the army of half-starved urchins who eked out miserable livings as crossing sweeps had been largely invisible to him, a necessary nuisance whose existence he acknowledged without really questioning it. He was just reaching the far flagway when Tyson exited his lodging and paused to close the door behind him. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in buff-coloured breeches and a military-styled dark blue coat, his handsome face hardening as his gaze clashed with Sebastian's. "We need to talk," said Sebastian. "I have nothing further to say to you." "Actually, I rather think you do. You see, I've just had an interesting conversation with several veterans of the 114th Foot." Tyson ran his tongue across his perfect top teeth. "Very well. Do come in." His rooms on the first floor were spacious and elegantly furnished with the same exquisite taste and expense he lavished on the raiment of his person. The hangings were of figured burgundy satin, the furniture of the finest gleaming rosewood. He did not invite Sebastian to sit, but simply stood with his back to the closed door, his arms crossed at his chest. "Say what you have to say, and then get out." Sebastian let his gaze rove over the shelves of leather-bound books, the gilt-framed oils, the marble bust of a Roman boy. Tyson appeared to be doing quite well for a younger son who'd just sold his commission. As if aware of the drift of Sebastian's thoughts, Tyson said, "One of my maiden aunts recently died, leaving me her portion." And then, of course, there's whatever you cleared from the sale of the spoils of Badajoz." Tyson tightened his jaw and said nothing. Sebastian went to stand before a tasteful oil depicting a fox hunt. "You told me Judd Foy's injuries came from a mule. Only that was never actually established, was it? In fact, there's a good possibility someone tried to cave in his head with the butt of a rifle. Now, why would anyone want to do that?" Sebastian continued his study of the room. "I think you paid Foy to perjure himself. Then you tried to kill him in order to eliminate the possibility that he might be inspired to tell the truth at some point in the future, and maybe even so that you could take back whatever you'd used to bribe him. Believe me, if I'd wanted to kill him, he'd be dead." "Actually, he is dead. Someone bashed in his head last night in St. Anne's churchyard. Fatally this time." Sebastian watched the other man's face carefully. But Tyson remained impassive, his only reaction a faint tightening of his lips into the suggestion of a smile. I'd be tempted to say how tragic, except that given the fact the poor sot's life was hardly worth much at this point, how ironic might be more appropriate, or perhaps how poetic. Sebastian felt no inclination to return the man's smile. Interestingly enough, he had a small pouch of loose diamonds in his pocket when he was found. "Am I to take it you're suggesting the gems implicate me in some way? And here I thought you believed me addicted to stealing jewels as opposed to using them to decorate the bodies of my alleged victims." "I think you failed the first time you tried to kill Foy, after Talavera. But since he couldn't recall anything, it served your purpose just as well. Only then he started remembering things, didn't he? Not everything, perhaps, but enough to realize that you owed him. So he came looking for you, and you decided to shut him up permanently. You lured him into the churchyard on the pretext of paying him off with a pouch of small diamonds, and then you bashed in his head while he was distracted by the gems." Tyson's smile hardened, "And then left them. What a curious thing to have done. I can think of two logical explanations. It's possible Foy had the diamonds in his hand when he fell, and in the darkness you couldn't immediately find them. Then the sexton came to investigate the racket he'd heard, and you had to abandon the search and simply run. And the second explanation. You deliberately planted the diamonds on Foy to make it look as if he murdered Isla. So you're suggesting, what, that I also killed Isla? You can't be serious." "I am, actually. You see, Isla liked collecting damaging information about people. And you have a dangerous secret. One you share with Beresford. And Yates." Tyson laughed out loud. Sebastian said, "You're the only person I know with a motive to kill both men." Tyson was no longer laughing. "That doesn't mean that I did it. Foy was mad. He discovered I recently sold a number of gems to Isla, and he somehow convinced himself that they were rightfully his. Isla told me the fool accosted him one night, demanded Isla turn over what he considered his property, threatened to kill him if he didn't." "What would you have me believe? That Foy killed Isla and stole the pouch of diamonds from him? And then what? Fell victim to footpads?" "It's possible." Yes, it was possible, Sebastian thought. Foy himself had admitted to watching Isla's house, and he was just crazy enough to kill Isla and take the jewels he considered rightfully his. But Sebastian didn't think so. He kept his gaze on the former lieutenant's hard, even-featured face. "We both know you're capable of murder." Tyson smiled. "That's something we have in common, isn't it, Captain?" Chapter 47. That afternoon, Cat Boleyn drove her high-perch phaeton to the physic garden in Chelsea. Leaving her horse in the care of her groom, she walked briskly down a dripping, mist-shrouded path to a secluded pond. When the days were fine, Cat could lose herself for hours in the old apothecary gardens, lush border beds, and vast plantings. But on this day, she was in no mood to linger. The man she had come to meet was already waiting for her at the water's edge. He turned as she approached, a tall, powerful figure in shiny hessians, fawn-coloured breeches, and a well-tailored dark coat. "Top of the morning to you," he said, exaggerating his brogue. His name was Aidan O'Connell, and he was the younger son of the Earl of Rathkeel, an ancient Irish family long infamous for their enthusiastic cooperation with the invading English. Cat still found it difficult to believe that this man, young, handsome, rich, had chosen to risk everything by quietly working for Irish independence. Like Cat before him, he had decided that one of the best ways to help the Irish and weaken the English was to assist their enemies, the French. He tipped his hat, a lazy smile deepening the two improbable dimples in his lean cheeks. "Is it too much to be hoping that you've had a change of heart and are willing to work with us again?" "You know me better than that," she said, as they turned to walk along the banks of the pond, the mist wafting cold and damp against their faces. "Ah, so I feared," he said with a mournful sigh. "Then why, pray tell, are we braving one of the coldest September mornings I can remember to meet?" "Because Russell Yates is about to hang for a murder he didn't commit, and more people are dying every day." When the man beside her remained silent, she said, "You know about the French blue." He squinted at the ghostly shapes of the chestnut trees on the far side of the pond. "I do, yes." "I need to find out who Napoleon has tasked with its recovery." "That I don't know." She swung to face him, the heavy woolen skirts of her carriage dress swirling around their ankles. "Don't know, or won't tell?" A soft light of amusement gleamed in the depths of his hooded green eyes. "Don't know, but wouldn't tell if I did." "Then at least tell me this. Is he English?" "In truth, I don't know. It may even be a woman, for all I've been told. But I do know this. Napoleon is not happy with his agent's performance. He's dispatched someone else, someone from Paris, to assist in the gem's recovery. Someone who's said to be quick and clever and very dangerous." "A man with a pock-marked face?" "I don't know. I haven't seen him." "I have. He tried to kidnap me from Covent Garden Market." O'Connell's lips tightened into a thin line. "I heard about that." "From your French masters?" His nostrils flared, his head rearing back. "Bloody hell! Is that what you think? That I had a hand in that?" "What else am I to think?" "I heard about what happened the same way everyone else in London heard of it. It's all over town. Besides which, why the devil would Napoleon's agents want to get their hands on you anyway?" "It makes sense if they think Yates killed Eisler and took the French blue. Steal Yates's wife and offer to make a trade." O'Connell was silent. "Well, doesn't it?" she said. The Irishman drew in a long, ragged breath. "I suppose it's possible, but if it is true, I know nothing about it." He reached to gently touch the back of one hand ever so briefly to her cheek. "And remember this. The French are no more my masters than they were yours. I work with them, not for them." She searched his deceptively open, handsome face. But he was a man who, like Cat herself, played a dangerous game and had learned long ago to give nothing away. She said, "Is there anything you can tell me that I might be able to use?" O'Connell shook his head. "Only this. I don't envy whoever has been set to this task. The potential rewards are undoubtedly great. But should they fail to recover the diamond, Napoleon is bound to suspect he's been betrayed, that his agents have simply decided to keep the gem for themselves. In other words, if they fail, they'll be killed," said Cat. "More than likely, yes. And they know it, which means that whoever you're dealing with is doubly dangerous, because their very survival depends on the successful completion of their mission. Get in their way, and you're liable to end up dead." He hesitated a moment, then added, "You might consider giving the same warning to Lord Devlin." Chapter 48. This was the part of a murder investigation that Sebastian always dreaded, when the bodies of witnesses and potential suspects started piling up, and for every question answered, 2 more arose. With a growing sense of urgency, he left St. James's Street and headed toward Tower Hill. The rain might have ended, but the wind blowing off the river was bitter cold, and felt more like December than the end of September. He found the surgeon whistling an old Irish drinking ditty as he bent over the granite slab in the centre of his small outbuilding. Naked and half eviscerated, the shrunken corpse of Judd Foy looked faintly blue in the thin morning light. "Ah, there you are," said Gibson, looking up. He set aside his scalpel with a clatter, and reached for a rag to wipe his gory hands. "Thought I might be seeing you then." Sebastian nodded to the cadaver's ruined head. "I take it that's what killed him." "It did indeed, most effectively." "What can you tell me about it?" "Well, the blow appears to have come from his left, which would be consistent with an attacker who is right-handed." "Unless he was struck from behind." Gibson shook his head. "Judging from the angle, I'd see he was facing his killer." Sebastian hunkered down to study the pulpy mess. "Any idea what he was hit with?" "Something long and heavy, and wielded with powerful force. I'd say whoever hit him was aiming to kill, not incapacitate." "Seems a curious choice of weapon. I mean, why bludgeon him? Much easier and surer to simply stick a knife between his ribs." "The bludgeon is a common weapon amongst footpads." "There is that. The intent could have been to make it look as if he'd been set upon by common thieves." Gibson tossed his rag onto a nearby shelf. "You do know this wasn't the first time someone tried to cave in his head, don't you? From what I can see, it's a miracle the man was alive." Sebastian straightened. "I heard he was kicked in the head by a mule in Spain." "A mule?" Gibson shook his head. "That was no mule." "Oh?" "I've seen men kicked in the head by mules, and I've seen what a rifle butt can do to a human skull when swung with a measure of force and skill." Sebastian nodded to the gaping wound. "Could this have been done by a rifle butt?" "No. More likely a length of lead pipe." "Lovely." He went to stand in the open doorway and draw the cold, damp air into his lungs. "I heard some interesting talk down at the pub a while ago when I popped in for a bite to eat," said Gibson, limping over to join him. "They're saying the authorities have decided to set Russell Yates free." Sebastian stared at him. "What?" Something about a pouch of Eisler's jewels found on our friend here. They are saying it's more than likely that he's the killer, but I don't think he is." Gibson studied Sebastian's face through narrowed eyes. "And here was I thinking you'd be over the moon hearing that Yates might be freed." Sebastian shook his head. He was remembering what Kat had told him about the visit Jarvis had paid to Yates's cell that first night, and the worry in her eyes when she said it. "Nothing about Yates's incarceration has felt right from the very beginning," he said. "Somehow this just seems all of piece with the rest of it. Could be just a rumor." Sebastian pushed away from the doorframe. "Only one sure way to find out." A supercilious clerk at the Lambeth Street public office informed Sebastian that Fridays were not one of Bertram Lee Jones's days of attendance. "He attends Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays," said the clerk, casting a sour glance toward the rear of the hall, where a blousy doxy in a tattered purple satin gown and improbably red hair was haranguing a constable in a high-pitched Cockney whine. "I didn't do nothing of the sort," she screeched. "I'm a good girl, I am." Sebastian kept his gaze on the clerk's thin, bony face. "So you're saying he was not in attendance last Monday?" "He was not." "Then how did he come to be involved in the committal of Russell Yates?" "As it happens, Mr. Lee Jones was in the vicinity of Fountain Lane when the hue and cry was raised. As such, he took charge of the pursuit and capture of the suspect and the interrogation of the witnesses before formally committing the villain to Newgate. He was here until dawn." "Commendable." The clerk sniffed. He appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with greasy dark hair plastered to a prominent skull, and a nose to rival that of Wellington himself. "Mr. Lee Jones is a most conscientious magistrate." "And where might I find him?" From the depths of the hall came the doxy's loud, strident complaint. "I'll tell you I'll never. 'Tis nothing but a Banbury tale, the lot of it." The clerk was forced to raise his own voice to compete. "Mr. Lee Jones does not like to be disturbed on his off days. You may come back on Saturday if you wish. We open at 11. I'm afraid this won't wait." The clerk went back to writing in his ledger. "Unfortunate, under the circumstances. You could see Mr. Dixon, the magistrate currently in attendance, or you can return on Saturday. The choice is yours." "And here I thought you just said Mr. Lee Jones was a most conscientious magistrate. I don't think you'll find him inclined to reward you for your zeal in protecting him from the palace." "The palace?" The clerk looked up, a wave of conflicting emotions passing over his face, doubt followed by indecision, chased by annoyance and chagrin. Sebastian started to push away from the desk. "I'll tell His Highness—" "No. One moment, please." Sebastian paused. The clerk threw a quick look around, then leaned forward to lick his thin lips and whisper, "His house is in the Crescent, off the Minories, number 4. "Thank you," said Sebastian, just as the doxy let out a high-pitched, ear-shattering squeal. "Oh! Say that again, you whore's son, and I'll scratch your blooming eyes from your head and feed 'em to the bleeding chooks." Bertram Lee Jones lives in a comfortable 18th-century townhouse built of good sturdy brown brick with white-painted window frames and a shiny green door. Sebastian half expected the magistrate to refuse to see him, but a few minutes after he sent up his card with the thin, mousy-haired young housemaid who'd answered his knock, she reappeared to say meekly, "This way, my lord." He found Lee Jones in a small chamber overlooking the Crescent. The room had been fitted up as a workspace, with a large, sturdy table in the centre, and an array of shelves piled high with a jumble of paints, pots, tools, and bins filled with pieces of fine wood. The air was thick with the smell of linseed oil and a pot of hot-hide glue. The magistrate himself sat perched on a high stool, a pair of spectacles on the end of his nose, as he focused on fitting a minute piece of rigging to a partially constructed model of a Spanish galleon. He cast a quick glance at Sebastian before returning his gaze to the model. "You have some nerve coming here," he said, his big blunt fingers surprisingly nimble at their task. "I'm told you believe the pouch of diamonds found on Judd Foy's body came from Daniel Eisler." "Oh? Who told you that?" "Is it true?" "As it happens, it is. Yes." "How can you be so certain?" "The initials, of course. You did notice them, didn't you?" "Not only that, but a woman at the greengrocer's on the corner remembers seeing Foy watching Eisler's house." Lee Jones sighed and straightened, his hands coming to rest at the edge of his work table. "One would think you'd be pleased to hear that evidence has come to light, suggesting your friend Yates is not in fact the murderer of Mr. Eisler." "You're saying that Judd Foy is?" "Was," corrected Lee Jones, pushing to his feet to putter around to the other side of his work table. "In Foy's case, the verb is most definitely was." "You'll be releasing Yates?" The magistrate's focus was all for his model. "I believe so, yes. We're simply waiting on a few more pieces of information." "Such as?" Lee Jones looked at him over the rims of his glasses. You can read about it in the papers along with everyone else. So, who are you suggesting killed Foy? Footpads, most likely. Fortunately, the sexton frightened them off before they were able to relieve the scoundrel of his ill-gotten gains. And Collot. Who killed him? Who? Jacques Collot. He was shot by a rifleman near Seven Dials last night. Ah! You mean the French thief. What has he to do with anything? Quite a lot, actually. I rather think not. The magistrate's protruding belly shook with his breathy laughter, although Sebastian could see little real humour in the man's face. I've no doubt it's a blow to your pride, having some common East End magistrate solve a murder that stumped you. But if it's any consolation, I myself was wrong about Yates now, wasn't I? The important thing is that Isler's murder has been solved. The man responsible is dead, and the good people of London can go to sleep in their beds at night without needing to worry there's some madman wandering in their midst. Sebastian studied Lee Jones's fleshy, florid face, the watery, blinking hazel eyes, the small mouth pulled back into a self-satisfied grin. He'd learned long ago that for far too many people it wasn't really important that justice be done. Unless they were personally involved in some way, most cared little if an innocent man was hanged. What mattered was that those in authority be seen as having successfully fulfilled their duty to keep the people safe from fear or any perceived threat that might disrupt the tranquillity of their lives. In that sense, Judd Foy dead was far more useful than Judd Foy alive. Dead men told no tales and answered no questions. Sebastian said, "And if Foy wasn't actually responsible?" The magistrate's cheeks darkened suddenly to an angry hue as he punched the air between them with one glue-smudged finger. He was no longer smiling. "No one will thank you for that kind of talk. You hear me? No one." "I'm afraid I can't agree that should be a factor here," said Sebastian, and left him there with his bits of wood and hemp and his pot of simmering glue. Chapter 49. Sebastian was crossing Pall Mall, headed toward Carlton House, when he heard himself hailed by Mr. Thomas Hope. "My lord," said Hope, panting slightly from the unaccustomed exertion of hurrying up the street. "This is fortuitous indeed. If I might have a word with you for a moment." "Of course," said Sebastian, moderating his pace to the other man's slower gait. "Is something wrong?" The banker's mouth worked furiously back and forth. "You've heard, I assume, that Yates is to be released from prison?" "I had heard, yes. Do I take it you find that troubling?" "What? Oh, no. It's not Yates's release that worries me, per se. It's what we're hearing about the death of this fellow Judd Foy. All these deaths associated with the diamond. It's as if it's cursed or something. First King Louis and Marie Antoinette, then the Duke of Brunswick, and now Isler and Foy and that French thief whose name for the moment escapes me. To be frank, I'm worried about Louisa." Sebastian studied the banker's homely, haggard face. He wondered if Hope realized he'd just admitted to knowing the true origins of his rare blue diamond. "You don't still have the diamond, do you?" "No. But then neither did the King and Queen of France when they lost their heads. Or Brunswick, when he was killed in battle. Or—" "People die all the time. I've no doubt if you knew the entire history of any large gem, you'd find many people associated with it who died violently. Apart from which, I don't believe Judd Foy actually had anything to do with the diamond." "You don't? But they're saying he's the one who killed Isler. Are you suggesting you now believe Yates?" "No. To be frank, I still don't know who killed Isler, or why." Hope sank his upper teeth into his lip and worried it back and forth as if summoning the courage to speak. "I fear I've not been entirely honest with you." "Oh? I told you I didn't know if Isler had a buyer interested in my diamond. That was not strictly true." Sebastian waited. Hope sucked in a deep breath, then blurted out, "Prinny. Prinny was interested. Most definitely interested." Sebastian said, "I had rather suspected that." "You did?" "I don't imagine there can be many potential buyers for a stone of that caliber." "True, true. But there is one thing you may not know. The prince's representative was scheduled to meet with Eisler in Fountain Lane the very night he was killed." "Do you know the identity of that individual?" Hope shook his head. "Unfortunately, no. But I should think it would not be at all that difficult to discover. I believe Lord Jarvis was also involved in the negotiations." "Jarvis?" Hope blinked rapidly several times, so that Sebastian wondered what the man saw in his face. "Yes, my lord." Sebastian's history with his father-in-law was defined by a level of antagonism that had included, but was not limited to, physical assault, larceny, attempted murder, and a certain memorable kidnapping incident. In one sense, Sebastian could not help but admire the big man's dedication to the preservation of England and her monarchy. But he had no illusions about the level of Jarvis's ruthlessness. The king's powerful cousin could have taught Machiavelli a thing or two about duplicity, cunning, and the unswerving elevation of expediency over such maudlin notions as sentiment, principle, and morality. To Sebastian's knowledge, Jarvis possessed only one humanizing trait, and that was his affection for his sole surviving child, Hero. The man despised his aged, grasping mother and his two foolish sisters, and would probably have consigned his addle-brained wife to Bedlam had it not been for Hero. But when Sebastian reached Carlton House, it was to discover that Lord Jarvis was not there. Swearing softly to himself, Sebastian turned toward his father-in-law's Grosvenor Square townhouse. His peal at the door was answered by a trim, wooden-faced butler named Grisham, whom Sebastian suspected had not yet forgiven him for a certain incident a few weeks before, when Sebastian had hauled a dead body up the curving staircase to dump it on Lord Jarvis's drawing-room carpet. "My lord," said Grisham, his professional mask firmly in place, "I am afraid Lady Devlin is no longer here, having left shortly after her conversation with his lordship this morning. Actually, it's Lord Jarvis I was interested in seeing." A breath of wariness clouded the butler's normally impassive features. "Unfortunately, his lordship is unavailable at the moment, as he has retired to his dressing-room in preparation for an important audience with—" "That's quite all right," said Sebastian, brushing past the butler and heading for the stairs. "I won't be but a moment." There was a time when such an intrusion would have motivated Grisham to call the constables. Now he had to content himself with closing the front door with unusual force. Sebastian took the stairs two at a time and entered the dressing-room without knocking. Jarvis was standing before his dressing-table, his back to the door. Pausing in the act of fastening his cuffs, he looked up, his gaze meeting Sebastian's in the mirror. He calmly straightened his cuffs and glanced over at his valet. "Leave us." The man bowed and carefully laid the neckcloths he'd been holding over the nearby daybed. "Yes, my lord." Jarvis waited until the man had closed the door. Then he turned to select one of the cravats. "Well?" "The prince's representative who was to meet with Eisler the night he was killed." "Who was it?" Jarvis carefully eased the length of starched linen around his neck. "Heard about that, did you?" "Yes. To be frank, I'm somewhat surprised you didn't make this discovery days ago." Sebastian gave his father-in-law a hard, gritty smile. "His name? The gentleman's identity is immaterial. An amateur, although highly knowledgeable lapidary who had agreed to inspect the gem prior to its formal presentation to the prince by Eisler at the palace." "Which was scheduled for when?" "Tuesday." When one is dealing with murder, no potential witness or suspect is immaterial. Jarvis smoothed the folds of his cravat, his gaze on his reflection in the mirror. "The gentleman in question arrived at the scene nearly an hour after the shooting occurred, and, upon observing the commotion, quietly left. He declined to step forward because he has no information of merit to add, and because it is of the utmost importance that the prince not be seen to be involved in anything of this nature." "And does the prince know, I wonder, that the gem in question was once the French blue?" "As it happens, he does. Indeed, the item he ordered designed for it was to be an emblem of the Golden Fleece." "But he isn't a member of any of the orders of the Golden Fleece." "He is confident that he soon shall be." Jarvis turned from the mirror. "I fail to understand your continuing interest in this affair. The authorities have determined some deranged ex-soldier murdered Daniel Eisler. I understand he was seen actually watching the house." "Judd Foy was watching the house, yes, but I don't think he killed Eisler." A faint smile curved Jarvis's full lips. "So certain." Sebastian studied the big man's half-averted profile. He could not shake the suspicion that behind this subtle play and counterplay of arrest, imminent hanging, and sudden release lurked Jarvis's long vendetta against Russell Yates and Cat Boleyn. He said, "And does the prince know that the diamond he covets was once in the possession of his own wife?" "That he does not know." "Yet you do." Jarvis turned, his face set in bland lines. 17 years ago, His Royal Highness took an unfortunate instant dislike to his bride. That dislike has since solidified into an aversion. Actually, I think I'd be more inclined to call it an irrational but powerful loathing coloured by a petty lust for revenge. And a determination, continued Jarvis, ignoring the interruption, to be rid of his wife. Such a step would, however, be disastrous for the stability of the realm and the future of the monarchy. Hence the need to conceal from the prince the entire history of the stone, said Sebastian. If my memory serves me correctly, the Prince Regent was named executor of Brunswick's estate, which means that Princess Caroline technically should have handed over to her husband's keeping any of the old Duke's jewels in her possession. Obviously, she did not do so. Caroline may be stupid, but she's not that stupid, said Jarvis. Fortunately, she at least stopped short of publicly accusing Prinny of playing fast and loose with her father's estate. Unlike her brother, the current Duke. Just so. Sebastian said, I think Daniel Eisler knew the circuitous route the stone had taken to come into Hope's possession, and was using that knowledge to apply pressure on the princess in order to obtain something from her that he wanted. You wouldn't happen to know what that was, would you? No. Sebastian studied the big man's complacent aquiline countenance. I don't believe you. Jarvis possessed a startlingly winsome smile he could use with devastating effect to charm and cajole the unwary and the credulous. He flashed that smile now, a sparkle of genuine amusement lighting his steel-grey eyes. Would I lie to you? Yes. The sound of Jarvis's laughter followed Sebastian down the stairs and out of the house. Chapter 50. I don't know how I can ever properly thank you, said Yates. The two men were walking along the Serpentine in Hyde Park, the evening sun glittering on the breeze-ruffled expanse of water, the long grass and frost-nipped leaves of the nearby stands of oaks and walnuts drenched with a rich golden light. Sebastian noticed Yates kept lifting his face to the setting sun and breathing deeply of the crisp, fresh air, as if savouring every subtle nuance of his new freedom. Sebastian said, You actually don't have much to thank me for, as it turns out. I had nothing to do with the authorities' decision to set you free. That was all Judd Foy's doing, however inadvertent that may have been. They're saying he killed Daniel Eisler.
It's always possible.
Yates glanced over at him. But you don't believe it?
No, I don't.
So how do you explain the pouch of diamonds they're saying was found in his possession?
Easy enough to plant evidence on a man's dead body,
thus casting suspicion in his direction. He's not exactly able to defend himself against the accusation now, is he? No, but why bother? The authorities were already convinced they had the killer, me, in custody. You don't find his death rather convenient, given the timing of the decision to set you free? Yates glanced over at him, a troubled expression drawing his brows together. And will you still continue looking for the killer? Sebastian paused to watch a duck lift off the surface of the canal, wings beating the soft evening air, its quack echoing across the water. After a moment he said, I wish I could believe it's all over, but I don't. Yates drew up beside him, his gaze like Sebastian's on the duck's awkward flight. He said, Cat doesn't trust Jarvis. Sebastian shook his head and blew out a long, heavy breath.
Neither do I.
Sebastian was walking up Brook Street when he noticed a tall, dark-haired man striding toward him with the long-legged gait of a soldier who has covered many, many miles. One hand in his coat pocket, Sebastian paused and let Jamie Knox come up to him.
Looking for me?
Sebastian asked quietly. Knox drew up, his yellow eyes narrowed to thin slits, his jaw set hard.
Judd Foy is dead.
I know.
Did you kill him?
I did not. Knox chewed the inside of one cheek.
I'm thinking he's dead because I told you where to find him.
I don't think so,
but I could be wrong.
Knox nodded.
You remember when you promised that if you ever discovered I shot that French lieutenant, you'd see me hang?
Yes.
So you'll understand when I say that if I find out you did kill Foy, you're a dead man.
Knox started to turn away. Sebastian said,
I didn't realize Foy was a friend of yours.
Knox paused to look back at him.
He wasn't. Bloody hell, the man was crazy.
Sebastian started to laugh. And after a moment, Knox joined him. Sebastian walked into the house, poured himself a glass of Burgundy, and went to stand staring thoughtfully out the dining-room window at the black cat, who was lying on the top step of the terrace, fastidiously engaged in the never-ending task of bathing its long, silky fur. An idea was forming in his mind, a suspicion born of a series of subtle inconsistencies and improbabilities almost too amorphous to name. He drained his wine and sent for Jules Calhoun. "What can you tell me about Bertram Lee Jones?" he asked when the valet appeared. The valet looked vaguely surprised. "You mean the chief magistrate at Lambeth Street Public Office?" "I do, yes." Calhoun opened his eyes wide and blew out a long breath. "Well, he's a piece of work, no doubt about that." "Meaning?" "He runs that district like it's his own private fiefdom. Makes the publicans give him a cut if they want to be certain he'll renew their licenses. And I suspect his handling of the vestry's poor fund wouldn't bear too close an inspection either. In other words, he's not exactly what one might call an honest man. Actually, I'd say he's fairly typical of East End magistrates." "Someone from Lambeth Street seems suddenly to have been moved to interview the woman at the greengrocer's on the corner of Fountain Lane. I'd be interested to know when that conversation took place." "I'll see what I can discover, my lord." Sebastian nodded. "Just be careful. This is a magistrate who thinks hanging half a dozen men before breakfast is good sport." Chapter 51. That night, as Kat prepared to leave for the theatre, a heavy fog rolled up from the river, swallowing the city in a thick white mist. She was in the hall, easing the hood of her cloak up over her hair,
when Yates appeared in the doorway from the library, a glass of brandy held in one hand. He'd been drinking steadily since his release from Newgate, although Cat couldn't say she blamed him. "I think perhaps it would be best if I were to ride with you in the carriage tonight," he said. "Good heavens, why?" He met her gaze and held it. "You know why." She gave a soft laugh that sounded forced even to her own ears. "I've never heard of anyone holding up a carriage on the streets of London, if that's what concerns you." "There's always a first time." "If it comes to that, I've a footman and a coachman to protect me." He drained his glass and set it aside. "Humour me." She smiled, a genuine smile this time. "All right." They drove through streets shrouded in white and unusually light in traffic. Yates said, "Devlin tells me he intends to continue his pursuit of Isla's killer." "Does that surprise you?" "In a way it does, yes. Isla was a vile excuse for a human being. What does it matter who killed him? The world is well rid of him." "Perhaps. Yet more people are now dying. An aging Parisian jewel thief and a half-mad ex-soldier." "Do you consider the world well rid of them too?" "I suspect there are many who would say the same of a Covent Garden actress, or an ex-pirate with a tendency to frequent the city's most notorious molly houses." His lips quirked into a crooked smile. "I suppose you do have a point. Still—" He broke off, sitting forward suddenly. They were rounding the long, sweeping curve from Oxford Street to Broad. The fog was thicker here, nearer the river, the dark trees and squat bell tower of St. Giles looming ghost-like out of the mist. "What is it?" she asked, just as a team of black horses erupted from a narrow lane to their left, eyes wild, hooves flashing, nostrils flaring wide in the cold night. In the horses' wake, a heavy old-fashioned travelling coach careened from side to side, its coachman driving straight towards Cat's delicate town carriage. "What the hell?" swore Yates as their own coachman shouted in alarm. Horses squealed, the carriage lurching sharply as their driver hauled his team hard to the right. Cat had a tilted vision of tumbled grey tombstones and the rusty spikes topping the churchyard wall. The carriage shuddered to a standstill. "Are you all right?" asked Yates. "Yes, but—" The coachman's startled cry cut through the night, followed by an ugly thump. She said in a low, urgent voice, "Yates," just as a man dressed in footman's livery and a powdered wig jerked open the carriage door, a blunderbuss pistol in one hand. "What the devil?" thundered Yates. The man grabbed Cat's wrist and hauled her forward. "If you're smart, you'll stay out of this," he warned Yates in an unexpectedly cultured voice. "This is madness," said Cat, falling heavily against him as he dragged her through the doorway to the pavement. The air was cold and damp against her face, the churchyard's earthy scent of decay thick in her nostrils. "We have nothing of value for you to steal." He pressed the cold steel of his pistol's muzzle against her temple and gave her a tight smile. "There's only one thing I need from you." Panic thundered her heart, caught her breath in her tight throat as she heard the soft snick of the pistol's hammer being pulled back. She lunged wildly against the hand on her arm, but his grip tightened cruelly, holding her fast. She saw Yates rear up in the open carriage doorway, a small pistol in one hand. The night filled with a roar of flames and the acrid stench of burnt powder, and the chest of the man holding her dissolved in a warm, wet spray of blood. He went down hard. "Mason!" shouted a second assailant, who'd been holding a gun to the head of Cat's own wide-eyed footman. "Yates, look out!" cried Cat, as the second assailant turned, levelled his double-barreled pistol on Yates, and fired. "Yates!" she screamed. Yates tumbled face first to the pavement. Arm outstretched, the assailant calmly cocked his pistol's second barrel and turned the muzzle toward Cat. Cat froze. "No, leave her!" shouted the heavy coach's tall, dark-caped driver. "That's Russell Yates you just killed, you fool. You know our orders. Grab Mason and let's get out of here." "Yates?" Cat went to crouch beside him. She was only dimly aware of the dark coachman whipping his horses, the old coach pulling away. "Oh, Yates," she whispered, and gathered his bloody, broken body into her trembling arms.
An hour later, Kat was crossing the entry hall of her Cavendish Square house when a peremptory peal sounded at the front door. She was expecting Paul Gibson, for she'd asked the surgeon to come examine her injured coachman. Instead, her butler opened the door to Charles, Lord Jarvis. She froze, one hand on the newel post, her husband's blood still soaking the bodice and skirt of her silk evening gown. Jarvis carefully removed his mist-dampened hat, a faint smile touching his lips as he met her furious gaze. "I believe we need to talk. Don't you agree?" Chapter 52. That evening, Hero attended a concert with her mother, while Sebastian settled in the library with a glass of brandy and the English translation of The Key of Solomon. He was still at it some hours later, when Jules Calhoun returned from St. Botolph, Aldgate. "Discover anything?" Sebastian asked, thankfully setting aside the ancient grimoire. "I did, actually," said Calhoun. "It seems that in the immediate aftermath of the murder, Lambeth Street showed little interest in interviewing the residents of the area." "When Yates was in custody?" "Yes. But constables began canvassing the neighbourhood on Wednesday, asking all sorts of questions." "Interesting, given that Lee Jones was at the time still confidently insisting on Yates's guilt." "Indeed, my lord. Yet it was Mr. Lee Jones himself who spoke to the corner greengrocer yesterday morning." "Not today?" "No, my lord. Definitely yesterday." "So, before Foy's death. I wonder what— Governor!" Sebastian broke off as Tom's voice echoed through the house. They could hear the boy's footsteps pounding across the entry's marble floor. "Governor!" The tiger burst into the room, eyes wide, chest heaving, mouth agape as he sucked in air. "Well, what is it?" asked Sebastian. "It's Russell Yates. He's dead." The ex-pirate lay beneath a sheet on a bed in his Cavendish Square house, his dark, too long hair a stark contrast to the white linen pillow cover, his hands folded at his chest, his eyes closed, his features so serene that he might have been sleeping. But Sebastian knew death when he saw it. Kat knelt beside the bed, her head bowed in prayer, the beads of a rosary slipping through her fingers. Sebastian paused in the doorway, aware of a flicker of surprise. He'd always known Kat was raised Catholic, but somehow he'd assumed she no longer practiced her faith. In that, he realized, he had erred. She looked up then, made the sign of the cross, and rose to her feet. He went to enfold her in his arms, and she came to him without hesitation and trembling with need. Her cheeks were stained with tears, and as she rested her head on his shoulder, a faint sob racked her body. For one long, suspended moment, he simply held her. Then she drew back, putting space between them. He said, "Tell me what happened." She swiped a palm across one wet cheek. "We were on our way to the theatre. Yates had insisted on riding with me. He never does that, but he was worried because of the attack in the market. We were just making the curve near St. Giles, when an old travelling coach came charging out of an alley and forced my own carriage into the churchyard wall. There were two men, dressed in livery as well as the driver, but I could tell by their voices that none of them were what they seemed. The driver struck my coachman with a long staff, knocking him from the seat. Gibson says he's concussed, but he should be all right." Sebastian knew a deep sense of disquiet. While some of the heaths surrounding the city could still be dangerous, it was unheard of for a carriage to be held up on the streets of London itself. She drew a shaky breath. "One of the men dragged me out of the carriage. He was going to kill me. Only Yates shot him And so—"
Her voice cracked. She swallowed, but it was still a moment before she could continue.
"And so one of the other men killed him. And then— it was the strangest thing. Once Yates was dead, they let me go and drove away."
"You think they were the same men who attacked you in Covent Garden Market?" She shook her head.
"No. These men might have been dressed as servants, but their voices were educated."
Her jaw hardened, her nostrils flaring with a quickly indrawn breath.
"I think they were Jarvis's men."
"You recognize them?"
"No. But he came to see me. Here. Tonight."
"Jarvis came here?"
She nodded. "Less than 2 hours after Yates was killed. He wanted to make certain that I had a perfect understanding of the situation that now exists between us."
"Namely?"
"I keep his secret. I keep my life. I choose to destroy him. I destroy myself."
Sebastian searched her strained face, noting the new lines of anger and determination that bracketed her mouth. He had never discovered the nature of the documents Yates held, but there was no doubt in his mind that they were powerful indeed. He said, "Did Jarvis tell you he was behind tonight's attack?"
"No, but what other explanation is there? Those men made it obvious their purpose was to kill me. Not Yates, me. But once they'd shot Yates, they let me live. You know our orders, I heard one of them say. I think Jarvis gave strict instructions that they were to kill either me or Yates, but not both of us."
"If the French are still convinced that Yates killed Eisler and stole the blue diamond, they would be very careful not to kill the only 2 people who might know the current location of the stone."
"True, but then why not kidnap me the way the men at Covent Garden sought to do? Why not take me, force me to hand over the diamond, and then kill me?"
He studied her pale, beautiful face. "I don't know. Have you managed to learn anything about the agent tasked by Napoleon to recover the French blue?"
She shook her head. "My friend claims not to have been told. From what he said, I suspect the individual involved is English, although a second person was recently dispatched from Paris to assist him."
"Him?"
"Or her. My contact did not specify which."
She fell silent, her gaze drifting back to Yates's pallid face. Sebastian reached out to take her hand in his. "I'm so sorry, Kat," he said. "I know how much Yates had come to mean to you." She drew in a deep breath that shuddered her chest. "In the past, I never allowed myself to be frightened, but I'm frightened now." He tightened his grip on her hand. "I will always stand your friend, Kat. Always, no matter what happens."
Her gaze met his. "Will you, Sebastian? And if Jarvis was behind this?"
"I told Jarvis a year ago that if he harms a hair on your head, I'll kill him. That hasn't changed."
"And what will it do to your marriage, do you think, if you kill your wife's father?" He said nothing, but there was no need, for they both knew the answer to her question. Chapter 53. Charles, Lord Jarvis, was with the Regent in a gaming hell near Portland Place, his bored gaze fixed on a spinning roulette wheel, when Sebastian walked up to him and leaned in close to say, "I understand you made a visit to Cavendish Square this evening." Jarvis shifted his gaze to the Prince.
"You refer, I take it, to my condolence call on Yates's devastated young widow?"
"A condolence call? Is that how you would describe it?"
"You would describe it differently?"
Sebastian studied the big man's full, arrogant face.
"A year ago I warned you that if you made a move to harm Cat Bullin, I would kill you. Understand this.
My marriage to your daughter changes nothing. If I discover that you were behind tonight's attack, you're a dead man."
Jarvis turned to look directly at him, the grey eyes that were so much like his daughter's, narrowed and hard.
"Likewise, I presume you understand that your marriage to Hero in no way protects you. You interfere in any way with what I deem necessary for the preservation and prosperity of the realm, and I will eliminate you, without hesitation or regret."
The two men's gazes met, clashed. Sebastian gave a slow, measured bow and walked away. Hero returned to Brook Street to find Devlin sprawled in a worn leather armchair beside the library fire, his gaze on the glowing embers, the black cat stretched out on the hearthrug beside him. He looked up when she paused in the doorway. A nearby brace of candles cast a harsh pattern of light and shadow across his lean features.
"Have you seen your father?" he asked.
"No. Why?
Have you two been at swords and daggers again?" "Something like that."
She went to rest one hand on his shoulder in an awkward gesture of comfort. "I heard about Yates. I'm sorry. I know you liked him." He covered her hand with his own.
"He was an interesting man. I'd like to have known him better. And now, he's dead."
"Kat Boleyn was unharmed in the attack?"
"Yes."
"Thank goodness for that, at least." She hesitated. "Surely you don't think Jarvis had something to do with what happened tonight?"
"Honestly?"
His head fell back, his gaze meeting hers.
"I don't know." She could feel the anger and determination that twanged through him, and she knew the heartache and deep disquiet of a woman who loved two men, a father and a husband, who hated each other. She said, her voice quiet but steady, "He's my father, Devlin. I cherish no illusions as to what manner of man he is. But I still love him dearly." "I know."
"And it doesn't make any difference, does it?"
"It does, but—"
"But not enough." She moved to scoop up the black cat and cradle him against her for a long, silent moment. Then she looked up. "I'm going to bed. Are you coming?" A soft whisper of ash falling on the grate filled the sudden hush in the room. He said,
"Do you want me?"
"Yes." Their love-making that night had an edge to it, a raw desperation that hadn't been there before. Neither spoke again of that day's events or of the shadow it had cast between them. But the awareness of it was there, as was the knowledge that the woman to whom Sebastian had lost his heart so long ago was now free. Saturday, 26th of September. Sebastian's dreams took him many places. To a wild, wind-swept Cornish hillside overlooking a rocky cove, to hot, fever-racked nights beneath a West Indian sky aglitter with a universe of unfamiliar stars, to a dry, sun-blasted land of smoke-blackened walls and vacant-eyed women and the desiccated, bleached bones of long-dead men. But that night Sebastian dreamed of demure ladies in gowns of heavy velvet and brocade, their wimples white in the spring sunshine. He wandered crushed gravel paths shaded by leafy chestnut trees, breathed in the scents of lavender and apothecary roses, vervain and lemon balm. Climbing the steps to a broad, freshly swept terrace, he entered a graceful sandstone house, its leaded windows unshrouded by ivy or cobwebs or the grime of ages. The flagstones beneath his feet were well scrubbed and unbroken, the newly washed walls hung with rich tapestries and crossed swords. As he moved down the passage, he heard the distant lilting notes of a pipe, a child's laughter, a man's chanting voice suddenly hushed. And he awoke with a start, legs swinging over the edge of the bed as he sat up, the icy air of the pale morning biting his naked flesh.
"What's wrong?"
asked Hero sleepily, rolling over to lay a hand on his arm. "There's something about Isla's house that has been bothering me for days now." She sat up, her dark hair tumbling about her bare shoulders as she hugged the quilt to her against the cold.
"What about the house?"
He pushed to his feet. "Something in the proportions of the rooms is off. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I want to take another look at it." He glanced back at her. "Care to come?"
"Do you think Perlman will agree to let us search the house again?"
Sebastian smiled. "I don't intend to ask him." The door to the crumbling old Tudor house in Fountain Lane was opened by a sour-faced woman in black bombazine and a yellowing cap. She was as stout as her husband was lean and a good 15 to 20 years younger, with thick, bushy grey brows, a bulbous nose, and small, dark eyes half hidden by fat, puffy lids. "Good morning," Sebastian said cheerfully. "I know who you are," she sniffed. "Campbell's off to market this morning, thanks be to God. Ever since you come here the other day, he's done nothing but crow about how he helped the great Lord Devlin with one of his investigations." Sebastian and Hero exchanged glances. Hero said, "We're here to look at the house again," and brushed past the housekeeper without giving her a chance to object. Just inside the entrance, Hero drew up in undisguised astonishment. "Good heavens!
"Sure, then the place ain't as clean and tidy as it could be," bleated Mrs. Campbell, her manner changing instantly from challenging to wheedling. "But then Mr. Isler was ever so particular about his things, preferring to see them disappear beneath dust and cobwebs rather than have me lay a hand on them."
"And did he take the same attitude toward the floor?" asked Hero, her gaze focused on the ancient flagstones half buried beneath decades' accumulation of dried leaves, dirt, and debris.
"It's only me now, you know, and I'm not as young as—"
Sebastian said, "Thank you, Mrs. Campbell. That will be all for now." The housekeeper sniffed and disappeared toward the kitchen, muttering beneath her breath. Hero turned in a slow circle, her eyes widening as she took in the jumble of exquisite dust-shrouded furniture, the row after row of grand old masters, their heavy gilded frames mildewed and fly-specked. "The entire house looks like this," said Sebastian. "And you think the proportions of the rooms are off? How can you even see the proportions through this mess?" Sebastian led the way through the stone-cased archway to the corridor. "First, look at the size of the chamber Isler used as his office." She peered through the door at the chaos wrought by Samuel Perlman's determined search for his uncle's account books. Sebastian said, "Now, come back through here." He strode to the long parlour and pushed aside the curtain that covered the second door. "And look at where this room ends." Frowning, she went back and forth between the two rooms several times, then came to stare thoughtfully at the parlour's back wall. "I see what you mean. It's as if there should be another small room between the two chambers. Part of the space is obviously occupied by the chimney for this massive old fireplace, but it's off-centre, and there isn't a hearth on the other side, as you would expect." She glanced over at him. "What are you suggesting?" Sebastian moved to the fancifully carved mantelpiece and began methodically pushing, pulling, and twisting the various intricately depicted beasts and fruit-laden garlands. "My brother Richard noticed something similar in our house in Cornwall. We eventually realized it was an old priest's hole everyone had long ago forgotten." Hero came to help, focusing her attention on the muntins, stiles, and rails of the panelled wall to the left of the hearth. But after a moment she paused and sniffed. "What is it?" he asked, watching her. "Don't you smell it?" He shook his head. "Mould, dry rot, dead men's bones, what?" "And here I thought all your senses were unnaturally acute." "Not my sense of smell. It's actually rather poor." She turned to look at him. "Really? I can think of any number of situations in which that would be a definite advantage. This obviously isn't one of them. What do you smell?" "Urine. It's very strong, and the smell is coming from behind this section here." She tapped on it experimentally. "Does that sound hollow to you?" "Yes." He stood back, his gaze assessing the joints of the age-darkened panelling. Now that he knew where to look, the subtle outline of one section was vaguely discernible. He reached for the dagger in his boot. "Your knife?" she said, watching him. "You're going to use your knife? For what?" He eased the tip of his blade into the joint nearest the hearth. "If I can find the catch—" He paused as he felt the edge of the dagger hit metal. He worked slowly and carefully, manipulating the catch in first one direction, then the other. Shifting the blade to beneath the latch, he pressed upward and heard a faint snick. The panel slid to one side. "I suspect that's cheating, but it's still impressive," said Hero. "Thank you." Thrusting his dagger back into its sheath, he pushed the panel open wider. The space beyond was perhaps 6 by 8 feet, dusty and empty, except for 2 iron-bound wooden trunks, a basket of small glass containers stoppered with cork, and a faint damp stain still visible on the paving stones just inside the opening. In the stale air of the ancient enclosed space, the odor of urine was pungent. Hero wrinkled her nose. "Do you think someone was shut up in here so long they couldn't hold it?" A crumpled cloth lying to one side of the entrance caught Sebastian's attention. Reaching down, he found himself holding a cheap configuration of yellow muslin reinforced by whalebone, its tapes badly frayed with wear. "Good heavens," said Hero. "It's a woman's stays." Sebastian passed it to her. "They're so tiny." She looked up to meet his gaze. "You think these stays belong to the owner of the blue satin slippers?" Sebastian swung around to look back at the long, old-fashioned parlour. Anyone shut up in the priest's hole would have had an excellent view of whatever transpired in the room, if there was a peephole. It took him only a moment to find it, cleverly worked into the pattern of the wainscoting. He said, "I suspect Isla shoved his bit of muslin and most of her clothes in here when they were interrupted by someone coming to the front door. She was probably watching through the keyhole when the visitor shot Isla, and was so frightened she wet herself. Yates said he burst into the house as soon as he heard the shot fired, followed almost immediately by Pullman." "So where was the killer?" "He could have bolted immediately for the rear entrance. Or he might have hidden behind a curtain until both Yates and Pullman were gone, and then run." "Followed by your blue satin Cinderella, who dropped her stays and didn't dare stop long enough to retrieve her slippers." "She must have been very frightened." "Well, she would be, wouldn't she?" Hero nodded. She folded the small tattered garment as carefully as if it was something fine and precious. "So she knows who the murderer is." "She may not know who he is, but she could probably identify him." Hero looked up, her face solemn. "The question is, does he know about her?" "I hope not." Chapter 54. The largest of the 2 trunks opened to reveal stacks of worn, leather-bound ledgers. "The missing account books?" asked Hero, peering over Sebastian's shoulder as he leafed through the top volume. He nodded. "Telling, isn't it? He leaves everything from priceless 15th-century Italian canvases to exquisite Greek marbles lying about the house gathering dust. Yet he hides these away." He moved on to the next, smaller chest. This one contained a curious assortment of objects, each carefully wrapped in squares of white or black silk, and bound up with cord. He unwrapped a snuff-box, a vinaigrette, a gold chain with a locket, such as a man might present to his bride as a wedding gift. Only, in this instance, the enamelled pattern on the face of the locket was worked into the golden crown and 3 white feathers of the Prince of Wales. He held it up. "Look at this." "Prinny," said Hero, reaching to open the locket. Inside lay a curled lock of golden red hair. "I think we now know what Isla wanted from Princess Caroline." "A locket with the Prince Regent's hair? But why? Can't be worth much." "It is to someone interested in magic operations aimed at increasing their wealth and attracting the favour of princes." Hero peered into the chest. "Is that what all these items are? The personal possessions of powerful people he wished to influence by casting spells over them?" "Influence, or destroy." Hero went to hunker down beside the basket. "What are they?" he asked, watching her lift one of the small glass containers. "They look like vials filled with—" She eased open the cork and sniffed. "Dirt." She turned it toward the light. "How very curious. Each is labelled with a name. This one says Alfred Dauncey." "I knew Dauncey. He blew out his brains last year. They say he was deeply in debt, all rolled up." She picked up another vial. "This says Stanley Benson. Isn't he the baronet's son who slit his own throat last winter?" Sebastian nodded. "Rumour has it he was also in the clutches of some moneylender." She stared down at the mound of glass vials. "Good heavens! Do you think all these people killed themselves because of Isla?" "I suspect so." She reached for another vial. "This one says—" "What?" he prompted, when her voice trailed off. Her gaze met his. "This one says Rebecca Ridgway." Sebastian studied her strained, suddenly pale face. "That's significant. Why?" "Rebecca Ridgway was Abigail McBean's sister, the one who died last spring." Miss Abigail McBean sat on the comfortably worn sofa in her cosy little drawing room, her head bowed, the small, dirt-filled vial in her hand. On the cushion beside her lay one of Daniel Isla's leather-bound account books, open to a page where the third name from the bottom read Marcus Ridgway, £2,000. Beside that, Isla had scrawled, "Paid in full, 2nd of April, 1812. Hero sat in an armchair near the fire. Sebastian stood on the far side of the room. After a moment, Abigail cleared her throat painfully and said, "Rebecca was my younger sister. She was quite different from me. Pretty, delightfully vivacious, always far more interested in parties than books. She married Marcus when she was just 19. Unfortunately, my late brother-in-law was a handsome and charming but sadly flawed man, weak, irresponsible, and capable of breathtaking selfishness. He was constantly in debt, but somehow he always found a way to right himself again." "What happened last spring?" asked Hero gently. "Rebecca came to me in tears just before Easter. She said Marcus had fallen deep into the clutches of some St. Botolph-Aldgate moneylender and was on the verge of ruin. I'd helped Marcus in the past, but he never paid me back, and I live on a very limited income." "You told her you couldn't help her?" Abigail nodded without looking up. "Yes." A week later, they were both dead. "How?" She traced her sister's name on the vial's label with trembling fingertips. "Marcus was found floating in the Thames, near the Wapping Stairs." "Do you think he killed himself?" "Marcus?" She shook her head. "In my experience, suicide generally requires a measure of either guilt or despair. But Marcus had a gift for convincing himself that nothing was ever his fault. and no matter how desperate his situation, he was always certain he'd somehow come about. Hero nodded to the open ledger. He obviously did. Somehow. Abigail's brows drew together in a crinkling frown. "And your sister?" Sebastian asked quietly. "They pulled Rebecca's body out of the river the next day." A heavy silence settled on the room, broken only by the distant sound of a child's voice chanting, "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's." Hero said, "What do you think happened to them? In truth?" Abigail looked up, her face mottled and puffy with unshed tears. "I think Rebecca killed him, and then she killed herself. Although I could be wrong. It could have been an accident. The coroner's court returned a verdict of death by misadventure." "Why did Isla have a glass vial of dirt with your sister's name on it?" "I don't believe he knew Rebecca was my sister," she said quietly. "When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey?" chanted the child in the garden below. Sebastian said, "How long before he died had Isla been coming to you for consultation on his work with the grimoires?" "Several years." "So when your sister told you about her husband's St. Botolph Aldgate moneylender, you must have suspected who she was talking about." "Yes." Sebastian was aware of Hero's hard grey eyes upon him, but all he said was, "Isla had a collection of these vials. I recognize several of the names of young men who recently committed suicide." Abigail's hand closed around the vial. "Some people believe that those who take their own lives will haunt anyone they blame for driving them to it. There are numerous operations in the various grimoires for binding the souls of suicides. Most are best performed with earth from the graves of the dead." "Chip, chop, the last man's dead." An outburst of children's laughter drew Sebastian's attention again to the window overlooking the garden, where a fair-haired little girl had collapsed with her brother in a fit of giggles. He was remembering what John Francillon had told him, that Isla feared dead men. He now understood what the lapidary had meant. Abigail said, "Did you find a vial for Marcus?" Sebastian shook his head. They had written down all the names on the vials and brought away with them Isla's account books. The rest they left as they had found it, carefully closing the section of panelling behind them. No. Abigail pushed out her breath in a strange sound. Isla obviously realized Marcus wasn't the type to do away with himself. Her gaze returned to her brother-in-law's name in the account book beside her, her brows twitching together in a troubled frown. I wonder how Marcus managed to repay his debt. Sebastian and Hero exchanged silent glances. But if Abigail McBean did not know the truth, Sebastian had no intention of telling her. "Admit it," Hero said to him later as they drove away from Abigail McBean's modest Camden Place house. "You think Abigail killed him?" Sebastian looked over at her. "Don't you?" He expected her to leap to her friend's defense and insist Abigail McBean was incapable of murder. Instead, she said, "Do you think Abigail knows that Marcus Ridgway forced his wife to prostitute herself to Isla in order to pay off his debt?" "I suspect she does, if she killed Isla. Otherwise, I hope not. She doesn't need to live with that knowledge on top of everything else." Hero said, "I keep thinking about all those glass vials. So many men and women driven to death by that loathsome man. And by their own weaknesses." When Hero remained silent, Sebastian said, "Think about this. Abigail McBean has known for the last 5 months that Isla was implicated in the death of her sister and brother-in-law.
Yet she continued to assist him with his interpretation of the ancient grimoires and their magic operations. Why?
Hero shook her head.
I don't know. It doesn't make sense. It does if you understand just how frightened of the souls of dead men Isla was.
You think Abigail was deliberately feeding that fear, to torment him?
Yes.
So why kill him? Why not simply continue to torment him, if she'd chosen that as her means of revenge? Sebastian stared out the window at the rolling, misty undulations of Green Park, deserted now in the cold and damp.
Perhaps she learned of another victim, someone she knew and also cared about. Someone who made her decide Isla needed to be stopped, permanently.
What other victim?
But Sebastian only shook his head, his gaze on a fog-shrouded copse of oaks. While Devlin settled down in his library with Isla's account books, Hero changed into a warmer carriage gown of soft pink wool and went in search of the crossing sweep named Drummer. She found the boy working to clear a pile of fresh manure from his corner. He was reluctant to pause in his labours, but the promise of a silver coin lured him to the steps of St. Giles, where he sat with his bare hands tucked up beneath his armpits as he rocked back and forth for warmth. Hero noticed he had acquired a sturdy pair of leather boots, only gently worn by their previous owner.
"You want to know more about the crossing sweeps?"
he asked, looking up at her.
"Not today.
I was thinking about how you told me that you and your friends often go to the Haymarket in the evening."
Yes,"
he said slowly, obviously confused by this new line of inquiry. "Have you ever found girls for a gentleman who takes them to an old man living in a ramshackle house just off the Minories in St. Botolph Aldgate?"
Drummer froze, his skinny little body tense as if he were about to bolt.
"Don't worry," said Hero gently. "You won't get into trouble for it. I'm trying to find a girl who was taken there last Sunday night."
"Do you know who she is?"
Drummer cast a quick glance around as if to reassure himself that no one had overheard her question. Then he nodded solemnly, his eyes wide and afraid. Chapter 55. Sebastian found the name he was looking for entered under the heading for June 1812. Major Rhys Wilkinson's debt was for £500 and had been partially repaid. He set aside the ledger and rose to go stand with his palms resting on the windowsill, his gaze fixed unseeingly on the misty street before him. He tried to tell himself that the death of both men on the same night could be a coincidence, that Rhys was not the kind of man to commit cold-blooded murder over a debt of £500. But he was haunted by the memory of a young girl with a dusting of cinnamon-coloured freckles across her sunburned nose, who'd once shot a Spanish guerrilla point-blank in the face. He was still standing at the window some minutes later when Hero's stylish yellow-bodied town carriage drew up before the house. He watched her descend the carriage steps, a ragged, incredibly dirty, gape-mouthed child clasped firmly by one hand. "We'll have sandwiches, cakes, and hot chocolate in the library as soon as possible," he heard her tell Morrie, her footsteps brisk as she crossed the black and white marbled entry hall. The room filled with the scent of coal smoke and fresh manure and grimy boy. "This is Drummer," she said, releasing the child's hand so that she could loosen the ribbons of her bonnet and yank off her gloves. "He's a crossing sweep at St. Giles, but he also works in the Haymarket in the evenings, helping gentlemen too shy to descend from their carriages to find girls." She gave the boy a nudge forward. "Make your bow, and tell his lordship about Jenny." The boy stumbled forward, a grubby, wide-awake cap clutched in both hands, his skinny chest jerking with his agitated breathing. "Jenny," prompted Sebastian, when the lad remained mute. "Jenny Davy," supplied Hero. "She's 17, and last Sunday evening she was hired by a gentleman in a hackney who was known to procure girls for a nasty old goat living in St. Botolph Aldgate."
Sebastian led the boy closer to the fire, where the black cat looked up in slit-eyed annoyance at their intrusion. What did this gentleman look like? Drummer raised a shoulder in the off-hand shrug of a lad to whom one member of the nobility was pretty much like the next.
I reckon he looks like a knob.
My age? Younger or older? Drummer frowned with the effort of thought.
Younger, I'd say, by a fair bit.
Sebastian and Hero exchanged glances. So Jenny Davies' procurer had not been Samuel Pearlman. Fair? Asked Sebastian. Or dark-haired?
He's got a mess of curls as gold as a guinea. The girls always go with him real quick because he's so good-looking. But he ain't never had nothing to do with any of 'em. Just takes 'em to that old codger.
Blair Beresford, thought Sebastian. Aloud, he said, Tell me about Jenny Davy. Again that twitch of the shoulder. Circumstances had obviously taught Drummer long ago to take life and people as he met them with little time for analysis or criticism.
What's there to tell? She's a doxy.
Where does she live? The boy's gaze slid away.
She used to keep a room at a lodging house in Rose Court.
But she's not there any more. Drummer shook his head.
There's been a mess of people looking for her.
Oh, such as?
Well, the curly-headed cove what hired her for one.
Interesting, thought Sebastian. Who else? The boy's shoulder twitched.
Some Frenchman. He's been looking for her real hard. He's even offered blunt to any of the lads what could tell him where she's gone.
Sebastian saw Hero's eyes narrow and knew that the boy had not yet told her this part of his tale. What does he look like?
He looks like a Frenchman.
Tall, short, old, young, dark, fair. Drummer frowned.
Older than you and shorter, but not real old or real short. I reckon he has a real bad pockmarked face, but I didn't pay him a whole lot of mind. I mean, I ain't about to bubble on Jenny, so why would I? She said if anyone was to come looking for her, he was to keep mum.
So you do know where she is. The boy sucked in a quick breath as he realized his mistake. He edged toward the door, but was stopped by the entrance of Morrie, who came in bearing a heavy tray loaded down with sandwiches, small cakes, and a pitcher of steaming hot chocolate. Hero said, Here, let me fix you a plate of sandwiches. Do you prefer ham or roast beef? The boy swallowed hard. Can I have some of both? He asked in a small, hopeful voice. You certainly may. She heaped the plate with a generous selection of dainty sandwiches. Is Jenny a London girl, born and bred? Drummer shoved a sandwich in his mouth and shook his head.
She and Jeremy, that's her brother, grew up in Bermondsey down in Suffolk. I remember him telling me their family had a room over the gatehouse of some old abbey down there. But their folks died of the flux some years ago, and they didn't have no kin, so they come up to the city looking for work.
Is that where she's gone now? Asked Sebastian. To Southwark. Drummer swallowed another bite of sandwich.
Nah, I wouldn't have told you if it was.
Hero poured the boy a mug of hot chocolate. We want to help Jenny, not harm her. She needs help, Drummer. I'm afraid those other men you mentioned who are looking for her might kill her if they find her. And they are determined to find her. You must tell us where she is. The boy paused in mid-chew, his gaze going from Hero to Sebastian and back. Hero said, I understand it's difficult to know whom to trust. Drummer swallowed. Hard. Tell us, said Sebastian, his voice quiet but implacable.
White Horse Yard,
Drummer blurted out, his chest jerking with the agitation of his breathing.
She's got a room at the Pope's Head in White Horse Yard, just off Drury Lane.
Sebastian took the boy with him, along with a hamper packed with more sandwiches and cakes, and a warm coat that had recently grown too snug for Tom. Hero was cross about her inability to accompany them, but even she had to admit that the uproar provoked by the appearance of a gentlewoman in a Drury Lane tavern was unlikely to be helpful. The warren of narrow, crooked alleys and foul, dark courts around the Drury Lane and Covent Garden theatres had long ago degenerated into a precinct of flash houses, low taverns, and rat-infested accommodation houses, where families of 10 or more could be found crammed into a single, small, airless room. Sebastian made certain both his coachman and the footman were armed, and slipped a small double-barrelled flintlock into his own pocket. It was still several hours before nightfall, yet already the narrow cobbled lane leading to White Horse Yard was filling with a rough, half-drunken crowd, and a thick mist that drifted in a dense, wind-swirled, suffocating cloak between the tightly packed houses. "Why did she take refuge here? Do you know?" Sebastian asked as the carriage drew up at the end of the lane. Drummer shook his head, his mouth full of cake. "I think maybe she used to work around here when she first come up to London." "How do you know she's here? Did she tell you?" "Her brother, Jeremy, tumbles with us. She wanted him to bring her some of her stuff a couple of days ago, and he asked for me help. Only she were right cross when she seed me. That's when she made me promise not to tell where she is." "She's right to be cautious." The boy looked doubtful, but paused to grab a couple more sandwiches and thrust them into his pockets before tripping down the carriage steps in Sebastian's wake. Sebastian grasped the lad firmly by the arm and held on to him as they worked their way through the surging, boisterous crowd. The damp, smoky air was thick with the smell of broiling meat and unwashed bodies, and the pervasive, inescapable stench of rot. The Pope's Head in White Horse Yard occupied what looked as if it had once been the carriage house of a long-vanished grand residence, its red-brick facade now worn and blackened by grime, a broken gutter dripping a line of green slime down one side. As they approached the inn, the door flew open, and 2 drunken soldiers staggered out, arms linked around each other's shoulders, and heads tipped back as they sang, "King George commands and we obey, over the hills and far away." Drummer hung back, eyes wide, lips parted, chest jerking with his agitated breathing. "Do I got to go in with you? I mean, you know—" "Yes," said Sebastian, hauling the boy across the entrance passage to the inn's dark, narrow staircase. "I need you to convince Jenny that I'm here to help her." "She ain't going to be happy I brung you." Lit only by a single smoking oil lamp, the stairs creaked and groaned beneath their weight. But the telltale sounds of their approach were lost in the convivial roar from the tap-room and the raucous laughter from a chamber at the end of the hall, and a man's well-bred voice raised in anger on the far side of the door nearest the top of the steps. "Where is it, damn you? I know you took it. Where is the diamond? Did you—" The rest of his words were swallowed by a woman's terrified scream. Chapter 56. "Help!" she shouted. "He's killing me! Somebody help!" Sebastian kicked in the door hard enough to splinter the thin wooden panels and slam it back against the wall. The room beyond was small and dingy, the air close and foul. A single tallow candle on a battered table near the narrow bed flared in the sudden draught, casting long shadows across the bare floorboards and ancient panelled walls. Blair Beresford, his hat gone, his handsome features twisted with determination, had pinned a tiny slip of a girl against a tall, battered wardrobe, her bird-like wrists clasped in one hand and wrenched over her head. "You son of a bitch," swore Sebastian, tackling him in a rush. The 2 men went down together, hard. Jenny Davy, finding herself unexpectedly free, broke for the door. "A guinea if you grab her and hold on to her," Sebastian shouted at Drummer, then ducked his head as Beresford swung a fist at his face. Sebastian scrambled to grab the man's wrists, grunting as Beresford jabbed his knee into Sebastian's groin and tried to scoot backward on his elbows. He was dimly aware of Jenny Davy shouting, "Ow, let me go, you little shabberoon!" as Drummer snagged her skirts and held on. Beresford threw another wild punch that grazed the side of Sebastian's jaw. Grunting, Sebastian fisted his hand in the front of Beresford's waistcoat and hauled him up to slam his back against the near wall. "God damn it," swore Sebastian, breathing hard. "Somehow I never pegged you for a killer." Beresford bucked against Sebastian's hold, then subsided in resignation, a trickle of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. "What the devil are you talking about? I didn't kill anyone." "Then why the hell are you here?" "The diamond." He jerked his head toward the girl. "She must have taken it." "I was thinking that if I could recover it, it would be a way to pay Hope back for all he's done for me." Sebastian swung his head to look over his shoulder at the girl, who had suddenly gone utterly still. "What makes you think she has it?" "Because no one else does, and she was there. I dropped her in Fountain Lane less than half an hour before Isla was killed. Look, I know I lied to you when I said I didn't take Isla a girl that night, but everything else I told you was the truth. I swear." Sebastian tightened his hold on the younger man, his lips curling away from his teeth in a hard smile. "Why the bloody hell should I believe you? I think you shot Isla, and now you're here to get rid of your last witness." "Oi, what are you talking about then?" scoffed Jenny Davy, her voice sharp. "He ain't the cove what shot that old goat." Then, as if suddenly aware that she had captured the interested attention of everyone in the room, she looked quickly from one to the next and tried to take a step back. "What? What's everyone staring at me for?" For the first time, Sebastian took a good long look at the girl Hero called the Blue Satin Cinderella. She looked more like 15 than 17, with an incredibly tiny, small-boned frame, and hair that might have been honey-coloured if it were cleaner. Her face was thin and delicately featured, her eyes a soft, luminous grey, her chin small and pointed. "You saw who did it," said Sebastian, releasing his hold on Blair Beresford. The younger man slid down the wall and just sat there, back pressed to the panels, legs outstretched. "Course I did," she said. "That old goat took and shoved me in a nasty little cupboard when someone come a-knocking at the door afore he was done with me. I saw the whole thing, and this cove," she jerked her chin dismissively toward Beresford, "weren't even there." "So who did shoot him?" Sebastian demanded. "How the bloody hell should I know?" "You just said you saw him." "That don't mean I know who he was." Sebastian tamped down a spurt of impatience. "But you can tell me what he looked like." Jenny shook her matted hair out of her face. "Course I can. A death's head on a mopstick he was." Sebastian stared at her, not understanding. "A what?" She huffed her breath and rolled her eyes. "You know, a tall, skinny cove what looks like he ain't long for this world. And he had one of them cavalry moustaches." Sebastian stared at her with the heavy heart of a man who has just had one of his worst fears confirmed. "If you ask me," Jenny was saying, "he weren't right in the head. He'd come in waving that gun around and saying he were there to bell the cat." "And then what happened?" asked Sebastian, keeping his voice even with difficulty. "That old goat, he laughed at the cove, wanted to know how exactly did he propose to do that. Only just then someone else come a-pounding on the front door real hard. The skinny cove got spooked and looked around, and the old goat pounced on him. That's when the gun went off." "And what did the, skinny cove do then?" "Why, he bolted out the back door, just afore these other two coves come in, one after the other, with a chinless, curly-headed one hollering murder." "And the diamond?" asked Blair Beresford from where he sat on the floor, a lock of golden hair tumbled across his dusty forehead. "What happened to the diamond?" Jenny Davy pushed out her lips, opened her eyes wide, and shook her head. "I keep telling you I don't know nothing about no diamond." "Then why are you hiding here in Covent Garden?" asked Sebastian. "Why didn't you go to the magistrates and tell them what you know?" He saw the leap of fear in her wide grey eyes, saw her small pointed chin jut forward in determination, and knew his mistake an instant too late. "Hold on to her!" he shouted at Drummer, just as Jenny hauled back her fist and punched the boy in the nose. "Ow!" he cried, tears starting in his eyes, blood spurting as he let go of the girl to cup both hands over his face. "Stop her!" Sebastian yelled as Jenny bolted for the stairs. "Bloody hell!" Sebastian pelted after her, half running, half falling down the steep, narrow staircase. He reached the entrance passage just in time to see the girl squeeze through a boisterous knot of drovers trying to shove into the tap room. By the time Sebastian pushed his way into the street, Jenny Davy had disappeared, swallowed up by the fog. Chapter 57. Sebastian returned to the Pope's Head to find both Drummer and Blair Beresford long gone. But the crossing sweep had simply returned to the carriage at the end of the lane and was waiting there for Sebastian. He had his head tipped back, the bridge of his nose pinched between one thumb and forefinger as he sought to stem the blood that still trickled from his nostrils. "Do I get my guinea?" he asked, his voice muffled by his oversized sleeve, "even though she got away from me in the end?" Sebastian handed the boy his handkerchief and steered him toward the carriage steps. "Considering your battle wounds, I'd say you earned yourself 2 guineas for this night's work." The boy's eyes grew round above the voluminous folds of Sebastian's handkerchief. "Caw!" Sebastian pressed the coins into the boy's hand and turned to his coachman. "Take the lad back to Brook Street and ask Lady Devlin to see that he's attended to." Drummer stuck his head back out of the open door. "You ain't coming?" "I shall be along directly," said Sebastian, closing the door on him. He nodded to the coachman, then went in search of a hackney to take him to Kensington. The curtains were not yet drawn at the Yeoman's Row lodgings of Annie and Emma Wilkinson, allowing a warm golden glow to spill from the parlour and light up the cool, misty night. Sebastian paused for a moment on the footpath outside. At the end of the street, the fenced gardens of Kensington Square lay dark and silent. But for a moment he thought he could hear the echo of a child's chant. "When will you pay me? Say the bells of Old Bailey." "Wait here for me," Sebastian told the hackney driver, and moved with an aching sadness to ring his old friend's bell. "Devlin!" A delighted smile lit up Annie Wilkins's features as she came toward him. "What a pleasant surprise! Julie," she turned to the housemaid who had escorted him up the stairs, "put the kettle on and bring his lordship some of that cake we—" Sebastian squeezed her hands, then let her go. "Thank you, but I don't need anything." She turned to the wine carafe that stood with a tray of glasses on a table near the front windows. "At least let me get you a glass of Burgundy." "Annie, we need to talk." She looked up from pouring the wine. Something in his tone must have alerted her, because she set the carafe aside and said with a forced smile, "You're sounding very serious, Devlin." He went to stand with his back to the small fire burning on the hearth. "I had an interesting conversation this evening with a young girl named Jenny Davy." Annie looked puzzled. "I don't believe I recognize the name. Should I?" "I wouldn't think so. She is what's popularly dismissed by polite society as Haymarket wear. A week ago her services were engaged by a rather nasty old St. Botolph Aldgate diamond merchant named Daniel Eisler." He paused. "You do recognize that name, don't you?" She held herself very still. "What are you trying to say, Devlin?" "Last Sunday evening at approximately 8:30, Daniel Eisler was shot to death by a tall, ill-looking man with a cavalry moustache. Now, I suppose there could be any number of men in London who fit that description. But this particular man seems to have had a fondness for old fables. He told Eisler that he'd come to bell the cat." She forced a husky laugh. "It's a common enough tale." "True. But I've seen Isla's account books, Annie." She went to stand beside the window, one hand raised to clutch the worn cloth as if she were about to close it, her back held painfully straight. Sebastian said, "You knew, didn't you? You knew Rhys had killed him." She shook her head back and forth, her throat working as she swallowed. "No." "Annie, you said Rhys went out for a walk that night at 8:30 and never came back. But Emma told me that her papa didn't get home in time to tell her a story that night. What's Emma's bedtime, Annie? 7? 8? She's in bed now, isn't she?" 7. Annie turned toward him, her face haggard. "I didn't know what he'd done. I swear I didn't. I'll admit I suspected, but I didn't know. Not until today."
"Why today?"
"I'll show you," she said, and strode quickly from the room. She was back in a moment, carrying a flintlock pistol loosely wrapped in a square of old flannel. When she held it out to him, he caught the sulphuric stench of burnt powder. "You know what Rhys was like," she said. "He'd spent half his life in the army. He knew the importance of taking care of his gun. He never fired it without cleaning it before he put it away. So as soon as I saw it like this, I knew." Sebastian carefully folded back the cloth. It was an old Elliot-pattern flintlock pistol with a 9-inch barrel and the gently curving grip favoured by the light dragoons. She said, "I didn't even know Rhys had borrowed money until he was already behind on the interest. That's when Isla said he'd heard Rhys had a pretty wife, and that he was willing to forgive the interest on the debt if Rhys would agree."
"I know all about the way Isla abused the women who found themselves in his debt," Sebastian said softly. "Did you do it, Annie?"
She drew back as if he had slapped her. "No."
"But you were tempted."
She pressed her fist to her lips, her eyes squeezing shut as she nodded. "We were so desperate."
"Annie, you could have come to me at any time. I would have been more than happy to help. I told you that."
She dropped her hand to her side and sniffed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I would never do that, and neither would Rhys." Sebastian searched her tightly held face.
"So what happened?"
"Rhys was so appalled by the proposal that he started looking into Isla. You say you know about the way he used people, but we'd had no idea. One night, when Rhys was telling me of the things he'd learned, I said, 'Something needs to be done about that bastard. There must be some way to warn other people to steer clear of his traps.' I didn't mean anything by it. I was just thinking out loud. Only Rhys said there was no way for the mice to bell the cat, that the only way to stop a man like Isla was to kill him." Her gaze dropped to the gun in Sebastian's hands, her breath backing up in her throat. "He'd been talking a lot lately about how much better it would be for Emma and me if he were dead, that Isla wouldn't be able to pursue the debt, that Emma and I could go live with my grandmother, that I'd be free to remarry." She swallowed. "I always begged him not to talk like that, but—"
"When was the last time you saw Rhys, Annie?"
She blinked, and the tears swimming in her eyes spilled over to stream unchecked down her face. "It must have been 9:30. He came home, shut himself in the bedroom for a few minutes, then left, saying he was going for a walk. I knew he had a bottle of laudanum he kept in a drawer beside the bed. After he left, I went and checked. It was a new bottle. He'd found an apothecary willing to mix it especially strong, just for him. It was gone."
"That's when you contacted me and asked for my help in finding him?"
She nodded silently.
"Annie, Annie, why didn't you tell me all this before?"
I was afraid. And ashamed. Perhaps more ashamed than afraid.
And when you saw in Monday's papers that Isla had been killed?
I don't know. I hoped it was just a coincidence. I mean, everyone was saying Russell Yates was found standing over the man's dead body. I didn't know then about the pistol. Not until today.
What made you decide to look for it today?
She scrubbed the heel of her hand across one wet cheek. The chief magistrate from Lambeth Street Public Office came to see me.
Bertram Lee Jones.
Sebastian felt his heart begin to beat faster.
What did he want?
He wanted to know when I had last seen Rhys. I lied. I told him the same thing I've told everyone else, that Rhys went out for a walk at 8:30 and never came back. But as soon as he left, I went to the bedroom and looked in the drawer where I knew Rhys kept his pistol. When I saw it, I knew.
She turned away, her arms wrapping across her chest to hug herself.
At the same time, I couldn't understand what had made Lee Jones suspect Rhys. But I suppose this girl you were talking about, this Jenny Davy, must have told him what she told you.
Sebastian shook his head. No, I think Lee Jones got the information out of Judd Foy, right before he killed him.
Annie shook her head, not understanding. Who is Foy?
A half-mad ex-rifleman who was watching Isla's house the night he died.
But why would Lee Jones kill him?
For the same reason he killed an old French jewel thief named Jacques Collot. Because the chief magistrate at Lambeth Street has a dangerous secret he'll do anything to protect.
She looked at him blankly.
Sebastian said, I think Bertram Lee Jones is working for Napoleon to recover a gem Isla had in his possession, a rare blue diamond that once formed part of the French crown jewels and is now missing. The assumption has always been that whoever killed Isla stole the diamond. At first, Lee Jones thought he had Isla's killer, Yates, in prison. But something seems to have convinced Lee Jones that he had the wrong man. He started asking questions, and that led him to Foy. I think Foy told Lee Jones about Rhys, and that's why he came to see you today.
You're saying that Rhys stole some diamond? But Rhys would never do anything like that. You know Rhys.
I know. I think Jenny Davy has it, and unless I can stop him, she's liable to be Lee Jones's next victim. It took what felt like an age for Sebastian's hackney driver to battle through the city's Saturday night traffic to the St. Botolph Aldgate home of Bertram Lee Jones. Then the housemaid, who opened the door to Sebastian's curt knock, dropped an apologetic curtsy and said, "Begging your lordship's pardon, but Mr. Lee Jones isn't here." "This is rather important," said Sebastian, aware of a rising sense of urgency. "Would you happen to know where he's gone?"
"I'm afraid he didn't say, my lord. Some Frenchmen come to see him maybe half an hour ago, and they all went off in his gig."
"All? Was someone else with them?"
The housemaid nodded. "Oh, yes, my lord. The Frenchman brung a girl with him. A tiny slip of a thing she was, and so scared."
"Jenny," thought Sebastian. "Damn, damn, damn." Aloud he said, "You have no idea where they might have gone?"
The housemaid screwed up her face with the effort of thought. "I think they might have said something about Southwark, but I couldn't tell you more than that."
"Southwark?"
"Yes, my lord," she said.
But Sebastian was already running to his hackney. Chapter 58. The ancient abbey of St. Saviour in Bermondsey, on the southern bank of the Thames, had once ranked amongst the proudest religious houses in England, patronised by kings and favoured by widowed queens in need of a place of refuge. Now only the lay church, a crumbling gatehouse, and a row of abandoned, half-demolished dwellings survived, their age-battered stone walls and broken slate roofs gleaming wet in the fitful, misty moonlight.
Why Lee Jones and his pock-marked French cohort would bring Jenny Davy here to her old childhood home, Sebastian could only guess. But as his hackney swept around the curve of the ancient elevated causeway that once led to the Priory, he caught sight of a gig drawn up beside what was now the parish church of St. Mary Magdalene. The gig was empty, the bay between the shafts grazing contentedly in the rank grass that grew along the wayside. Sebastian could see a narrow beam of light, as if from a shuttered lantern, weaving amongst the mossy grey tombs and tumbled headstones of the dark, fog-shrouded churchyard beyond. "Pull up here," Sebastian ordered. The hackney driver obliged. "You want I should wait for you again, your lordship?" he asked hopefully. He obviously considered a night of dozing on the box far preferable to one spent constantly hustling new fares. "Just take care to keep out of sight." Sebastian dropped quietly to the ground, then handed up his card to the jarvey. "And if anything should happen to me, take this to Sir Henry Lovejoy in Bow Street, and tell him what you know of this night's work." "Aye, my lord." Leaving the hackney in the shadows of a line of darkened, dilapidated shops, Sebastian slipped down the street. The air here was heavy and wet and thick, with the pungent odours of the nearby tannery yards and glue manufactories and breweries. On the flagway beside the church's ancient medieval tower, he paused, a cold wind billowing the mist around him. He could see them now, 3 mist-shrouded figures, the magistrate's form tall and bulky, the Frenchman small, agile, the girl dragged along with one frail arm gripped in Lee Jones's meaty fist as they worked their way through the sunken, crowded graves. The moon had utterly disappeared behind the thick, bunching clouds. The wall surrounding the churchyard was built of stone and low and crumbling. Sebastian climbed it easily. Hunkering down, he was slipping cautiously from one tomb to the next when the girl's voice, sounding surprisingly strong, stopped him. "This is it," she said. "You're certain this time?" snapped Lee Jones, raising his lantern to peer at the tomb before them. "I think so." The Frenchman gave a scornful laugh. "That's what she said before she wasted 10 minutes digging around the foundations of the last tomb where she insisted she'd hid it." "It ain't easy to see in the dark. Maybe if we could come back tomorrow when it's light, I could—" Lee Jones said, "Just shut up and dig." The Frenchman pulled a pistol from his waistband and pressed the muzzle against the girl's temple. "Only make certain you have the right tomb this time, ma petite. No more games, Jenny Davy froze, the moist wind curling the honey-coloured hair around her fine-boned face and flattening the skirts of her ragged dress against her legs. Unlike the 2 men, who were muffled in greatcoats and hats, she was bareheaded, her arms covered only by the thin stuff of her dress and wrapped across her chest for warmth. She stared back at the Frenchman, as if evaluating the seriousness of his threat. She must have decided he meant it, because she jerked her head toward a tomb that lay closer to the long wall of the church's nave. "I think maybe I made a mistake, and it's over there." The Frenchman grunted. She led them to a tomb so old the weathered, moss-covered stones were cracked and crumbling, the top tilted at a 45-degree angle. Crouching down near one end, she began to dig at the base, the rush of the disturbed, falling rubble sounding unnaturally loud in the fog-shrouded night. At some point she'd obviously brought the diamond here, to the place where she'd played as a child, and hidden it. As Sebastian watched, she hesitated in her digging. Then her left hand swooped into the rubble to close over something, just as her right seized a chunk of stone the size of her fist. He could see the tension in every line of her body, see her gathering herself like a sprinter ready to run. Lee Jones had set the lantern atop the tomb, and now stood slightly off to one side while the Frenchman had positioned himself nearby, his pistol held in a slackened grip. As Sebastian watched, Jenny drew back her hand and chucked the jagged rock at the Frenchman's head. "Mon Dieu!" he swore. He tried to duck, lost his footing, and went down with a grunt. Darting up, Jenny took off, running across the darkened churchyard toward the ancient ruined gatehouse, shrouded by mist in the distance. "Don't just stand there, you fool!" shouted the Frenchman, scrambling to his feet. "After her! She's got the diamond!" Lee Jones started off down the slope in a lumbering trot. "For God's sake, just shoot her!" Taking careful aim on the girl's running figure, the Frenchman was tightening his finger on the trigger when Sebastian barreled into him. The impact knocked the Frenchman flat on his back, the pistol exploding harmlessly into the air as it flew from his hand and spun out of sight into the high grass. Rolling nimbly away from Sebastian's grasp, he reared up into a crouch, a knife gleaming in his fist. "You again!" he spat. Leaping to his feet, Sebastian snatched the horn lantern from the tomb's cracked surface just as the Frenchman lunged, blade flashing. Pivoting, Sebastian smashed the lantern down on the Frenchman's hand, plunging them into darkness and sending the knife clattering against the side of the tomb. As the Frenchman staggered back, Sebastian swung the lantern again, this time at the man's head. The Frenchman ducked, then came up with an explosive kick that drove the heel of his boot into Sebastian's right knee. Sebastian's leg collapsed beneath him in a fireball of pain. As he fell, the Frenchman kicked at him again, aiming this time for Sebastian's head. Hands flashing up, Sebastian grabbed the French agent's boot with both hands and twisted. Caught off balance, the Frenchman fell back, his head making an ugly thwunking sound as it struck the edge of the tomb. He slithered down the side of the moss-covered monument in a disjointed sprawl, then lay still, an ugly sheen of dark wetness staining the weathered stone behind him. Staggering to his feet, Sebastian gritted his teeth and set off in an ungainly lope toward the ancient abbey gatehouse at the base of the churchyard. Every step sent an excruciating jolt of agony radiating up from his injured knee, so that by the time he reached the rubbish-strewn cobbled court before the ruined gatehouse, a cold sweat filmed his body, and his breath was coming ragged and fast. Built of coursed, rough stone, the gateway rose a story and a half above its central vaulted archway. Once the recessed arch had been richly ornamented with carvings, the mullioned windows above embellished with a vine-like tracery. But the passing centuries had battered and crumbled the stone, while the smoke and grime of generations had blurred and obliterated the details of what remained. To the west of the gatehouse ranged a long two-story stone building that might once have been an attached guest-house or almonary, but had long since degenerated into mean lodgings. Now the buildings stood vacant, windows and doorways gaping, roof tiles broken and missing, their supporting timbers collapsing. All other traces of the abbey had vanished long ago. Beyond these few ruined fragments stretched only market gardens and open fields, empty beneath the wind-bunched clouds scuttling and thickening across the black sky. Jenny Davy and Bertram Lee Jones had disappeared. Pausing in the shadows of the gatehouse's arched passageway, Sebastian stood still, listening. He heard the scuff of a heavy tread overhead, a girl's frightened gasp. Then came Lee Jones's voice, pitched to a coaxing croon that did little to disguise the gruff anger roiling beneath. "I'm not going to hurt you, girl. All I want is the diamond. Just give me the diamond and I'll let you go." "You take me for a flat," yelled Jenny, her voice high-pitched with fear and defiance. "Don't you come near me." Moving quietly, Sebastian crept up the tightly wound medieval staircase that opened to one side of the vaulted passage. The old stone treads were worn into such deeply sunken grooves in the centre that the awkwardness of each step twisted his injured knee and stole his breath. By the time he reached the single chamber above, it was empty. At one time this had been a grand space, with oak-panelled walls and a sandstone fireplace built into the opposite wall, but much of the panelling had been torn down and burned for firewood, while part of the chimney had collapsed into a cascade of rubble strewn across the room's scarred wooden floor. At the far end of the chamber, a crude ladder led to the loft above. Sebastian had one foot on the first rung when Jenny screamed again. "Get back!" she cried. "I'm telling you!" "What are you going to do, you fool girl?" growled Lee Jones. "Don't go out there, are you mad? You'll slip and fall to your death." "I told you, stay away from me." "You stupid strumpet. Get back in here. I get my hands on you, I swear to God I'm going to kill you." Sebastian scrambled up the ladder to find himself in a low-pitched garret, musty with age and damp and rot. Patches of black sky showed through a jagged hole in the roof. Most of the row of casement windows built into the gabled end were gone, their casings gaping vacant to the wet, windy night. Crossing swiftly over to the opening, Sebastian found himself staring out over the roof of the adjoining structure. Straddling the ridge beam, the way a man would ride a horse, the magistrate had stripped off his cumbersome greatcoat and was carefully scooting his way forward on his rump. Jenny Davy was already some 10 to 15 feet ahead of him. She was small and light enough to scramble over the tiles on her feet, although she was bent over nearly double, using her hands to help steady her balance on the wet, mossy slates. "Come back here, you bloody doxy!" Lee Jones roared. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, her step faltering as she reached the gable end. There was another, smaller building that abutted this one, but its roof was some 3 or 4 feet below where she stood, and of a steeper pitch. Sebastian saw her creep closer to the edge, then waver. "Jenny, don't jump!" Sebastian shouted. "Stay where you are!" Lee Jones jerked around to stare at him, his jaw thrusting out in annoyed fury, while Jenny screamed, "Go away and leave me alone, all of you!" If she had turned onto her stomach and eased herself carefully over the gabled point, she might have made it. Instead, she rose and jumped. Sebastian heard the clatter of breaking, falling tiles as she landed, lost her footing, and went down, vanishing from his sight. She let out a sharp scream, and Sebastian's breath caught in his throat. But she must somehow have managed to grab a handhold and stop her descent, because he heard her gasp, then fall utterly silent. "Jenny!" Sebastian shouted, swinging his legs over the broken sill to the slates below. "Hang on!" "You bloody interfering bastard!" growled the magistrate. Grasping the roof's peak, he managed with surprising agility to swing his legs up and around, reversing his position, so that he now faced Sebastian. "I should have had you killed when I had the chance." "Give it up, Lee Jones," said Sebastian, hunkering down to lower his centre of gravity. "You've had a good run, but the game's up now." Lee Jones picked up a broken slate and chucked it at Sebastian's head. "I'll see you in hell." Sebastian managed to duck the first 2 broken tiles. The edge of the third sliced open a long cut across his forehead. "God damn it," he swore. He took another step forward and felt his right foot punch through the rotten roof. Chapter 59. The collapsing roof pitched Sebastian sideways. He grabbed the ridge of slate at the peak with his left hand, stopping his fall. But he was now pinned by his injured right leg, with his other leg splayed out awkwardly to the side, and only one hand free. "Looks like you're in trouble, don't it?" said the magistrate. Breaking off a long, jagged piece from the tile at his side, Lee Jones inched himself forward, the pointed slate clutched in his right fist like a knife. The wind gusted up, carrying a splattering of raindrops that pattered on the mossy slate and stung Sebastian's face. Smiling, Lee Jones slashed downward with his blade, aiming straight for Sebastian's heart. Sebastian clamped his free hand around the magistrate's wrist, stopping the slate's descent. Still grinning, Lee Jones wrapped his other fist around his right wrist and leaned his considerable weight into his hands. The improvised blade inched lower. Sebastian could feel the blood pounding in his head, hear his breath coming in ragged gasps. A warm wetness coursed from his cut forehead to sting his eyes. He scraped his left boot heel over the slates, desperate to find some purchase. Then the roofing under his left boot gave way, plunging his leg down into the emptiness beneath. For a moment, he thought the entire roof was collapsing beneath their combined weights. Then he realized the ridge beam still held, and that he was now effectively straddling it. Shifting his weight, he locked his ankles together beneath him. "You greedy, traitorous son of a bitch," he snarled, freeing his left hand to slam a punch up into the magistrate's plump face. The magistrate reeled back, his massive bulk no longer pressing the jagged slate towards Sebastian's heart. Gritting his teeth, Sebastian grasped the magistrate's wrist with both hands and drove the deadly point straight down into Lee Jones's own gut. He saw the magistrate's eyes widen, saw his full cheeks expand with a mingling of shock and fury. Then he slipped sideways, shattering slates and smashing fragile timbers as his heavy body picked up speed. He flung his arms out, fingers scrabbling, frantic for a handhold, but his momentum was too great. He slid to the roof's edge and shot off it into the void. He gave one high-pitched scream that was cut off by the thump of his body hitting the cobbles far below. His breath still coming in harsh gasps, Sebastian wiped the mingling sweat and blood from his face with his forearm. Then, unlocking his ankles and carefully balancing his weight on both hands, he levered himself up out of the twin holes he'd punched through the roof's rotten fabric. "Jenny," he called, cautiously inching his way to the end of the building. He could see her now. She lay face down at the edge of the lower roof, her skirts and petticoats a torn, rucked-up froth around her. "Hold on," he said, easing himself down to the smaller, steeper roof. "I'm here to help you." Clamping one arm around the rough brickwork of the chimney that thrust up at the juncture of the two buildings, he leaned forward as far as he dared, to where the girl clung to the edge, but he still couldn't quite reach her. "Grab my hand," he told her, and prayed the damned chimney would take their combined weights. "Why should I trust you?" she shouted, her voice snatched away by the buffeting wind. "Because if all I wanted was the diamond, damn it, I'd let you fall off this damned roof and simply take the bloody stone from your dead body. That's why." She lay still, her face a white mask of terror and indecision. Then, very slowly, she reached out a trembling hand toward him. Tiny, claw-like fingers clamped around his arm. Sebastian clasped his own hand around her wrist, then said gently, "I've got you. All you need to do now is climb toward me, slowly." She inched her way up the steep, mossy slope. The wind snatched at her skirts, the rain poured. Once a fragment of slate broke beneath her foot and spun away into the darkness below. She let out a soft whimper, but kept climbing. When she was close enough, he shifted his grip on the chimney and hauled her up to him. They sat side by side, their backs pressed to the chimney's rough brick, their breath sawing in their chests, the wind driving the cold rain in their faces. After a moment, she swallowed hard and said, "How do we get down from here?" Sebastian looked over at her and grinned. "Very carefully." Chapter 60. Sunday, 27th of September. Brilliant and breathtakingly beautiful, the sapphire-blue diamond lay nestled in a velvet-lined box on Sir Henry Lovejoy's desk. Sir Henry frowned down at it a moment, then raised his gaze to Sebastian. "You're certain you wouldn't rather return the gem to Mr. Hope yourself?" "I think not." Sir Henry cleared his throat. "And this girl you were telling me about, the one who took the diamond from Isla's house, what was her name again?" Sebastian kept his features carefully composed. "Jenny." "Just Jenny?" "I'm afraid so." "I see. And she slipped away into the night before you could secure her, so that she might face charges for the theft?" "Just so." Sir Henry went to stand at the window overlooking the morning bustle of Bow Street. "So you're saying Major Wilkinson shot Isla, but Bertram Lee Jones killed Jacques Collot because the Frenchman found out Lee Jones was working for Napoleon?" "Yes. And Lee Jones killed Judd Foy for essentially the same reason, so that his surreptitious interest in the diamond's whereabouts would remain unknown. That, and so that he could plant the evidence on Foy's body to make it look as if the rifleman had killed Isla. But Lee Jones already had a strong case against Yates." Sebastian shrugged. Given that Lee Jones had figured out that Yates wasn't the killer, he probably worried that the case against Yates might crumble, And the last thing Lee Jones wanted was renewed public interest in the murder. Sebastian also had a sneaking suspicion Lee Jones was under pressure from Jarvis to release Yates, but he kept that possibility to himself. "Yes, it all makes sense," said Sir Henry after a moment. "But without the girl's testimony, your explanation of the events that likely transpired the night of Isla's murder, while certainly plausible, must of necessity remain unproven. I therefore see no purpose in reopening an investigation that has already been officially closed." He paused to look around, one eyebrow raised. "Unless, of course, you know where the girl might be found?" Sebastian shook his head. "Sorry, no." That, at least, was the truth. He saw no reason to add that his ignorance was deliberate, or that Hero knew exactly where Jenny Davy had found refuge. Unfortunate. Sir Henry ran the thumb and forefinger of one hand up and down his watch chain while he chewed his inner lip. "I've been contacted by the palace. It seems the prince's advisers have decided that the populace would be better off without the knowledge that a prominent London magistrate was actually working for the Emperor Napoleon. The people will therefore be told that Lee Jones was killed in the process of apprehending a dangerous French agent." "How is the dangerous French agent doing, by the way?" "He's still alive, but I'm told he won't be for much longer. He's never regained consciousness." Sir Henry hesitated, then added, "Lee Jones is to be given a hero's funeral. There's even talk of the prince himself attending." "How ironic." "It is, yes, but necessary. I wonder how long he'd been working for the French. If his bank account is anything to go by, I'd say quite some time. Makes you wonder, doesn't it, how many others like him are out there, people who are both known and respected, yet whose allegiance is elsewhere." "I suppose we'll never know," said Sebastian, limping slightly as he turned toward the door. "Lord Devlin?" Sebastian paused to look back at him. "I'm sorry about your friend." Sebastian nodded, but he did not trust himself to speak. Leaving Bow Street, Sebastian drove to the southwestern corner of Hyde Park. Once there, he left the horses in Tom's care and cut across the rough grass to the canal, near which Rhys Wilkinson's body had been found. The rain had been heavy during the night, leaving the long grass wet and sodden, and battering the last of the frost-tinged leaves clinging to the surrounding trees. There was a loneliness here that sank deep into a man, a yawning melancholy that seemed a part of the white empty sky and the tracery of branches, and the haunting call of the geese lifting off the surface of the canal. He stood for a time beside the frost-nipped reeds, his gaze on the flat pewter expanse of the water before him. He thought about the laughing devil-may-care officer he'd once known, and of the despair Rhys must have felt when he looked his last upon this scene. Shrugging the image away, Sebastian began to walk along the edge of the canal, criss-crossing purposefully back and forth, his gaze on the cold, wet mud oozing up between the reeds at his feet. Lovejoy's constables had searched here before him, he knew, but he suspected their effort had been half-hearted, their explanation for the invalid officer's death already running to seizure or heart failure. It was some minutes before he found what he was looking for. A light blue bottle, some 4 inches high, its stopper gone, but with the dark yellow label proclaiming laudanum, poison, still largely intact. Reaching down, he picked it up, the silt-laden water lapping cold against his hand as his fingers closed around the bottle. Empty now, but for a faint, reddish-brown smudge in one corner. There was no way of knowing how long it had lain here. An hour? A day? A week? It suggested everything, but proved nothing. Sebastian felt his fist tighten around the heavy glass with an unexpected surge of raw anger. Drawing back his arm, he hurled the bottle far out into the waterway. It hit with a plopping splash, then sank quickly out of sight. Sebastian stood and watched the ripples fade to stillness. Then he turned and walked away. "Do you blame him for what he did?" Hero asked. She was seated in the armchair beside the fire in her chamber, with Sebastian on the rug beside her. "Wilkinson, you mean?" He leaned his head back against her knee and drew in a deep breath. "I'm still not convinced he went there to kill Isla. He could have had some other scheme in mind." "A way to bell the cat?" "Perhaps. Only events got away from him, as they have an unfortunate tendency to do." "And then he killed himself," she said quietly, "to spare his family the shame of the trial, and to give his wife and child a chance at a better life without him." He felt her fingers playing with the hair that curled at the nape of his neck. "We don't take good care of the men we ask to risk their lives and health for us, do we? We use them, and then when they're no longer of value, we toss them away." "King George commands and we obey," quoted Sebastian, "over the hills and far away." He turned to face her, his hands coming to rest on the growing swell of her belly. "Lately I find myself wondering what the world will be like when she grows up." "He," said Hero firmly. Sebastian laughed. "You're certain of that, are you?" Her lips curved into a slow smile, and he thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "Yes."
The end. You've been listening to What Darkness Brings, a Sebastian Saint-Cyr mystery by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter, and directed by Erica Jensen. The author concludes this book with the following note. The theft of the French crown jewels from the Garde Meuble in Paris in September of 1792 was essentially as described here, although the involvement of Danton and Roland, while suggested, has never been proven. Napoleon's determination to recover the French crown jewels, as well as the ruthlessness of the methods he employed, was likewise real. The identification of the Hope diamond as the recut French blue is now generally accepted. An old lead cast of the French blue, with a label saying it belonged to Mr. Hope of London, recently discovered in a drawer in the French National History Museum in Paris, was donated in 1850 by a descendant of the Achard family. Interestingly enough, Charles Achard was both a close associate of the Hopes and one of the lapidaries tasked by Napoleon to recover the French crown jewels. How Hope acquired the diamond is not known, although multiple theories exist. I have chosen the one best suited to my story. It is significant that Napoleon, who surely knew more than we do about the events of September 1792, always believed that the Duke of Brunswick, father of the Princess of Wales, Caroline, had been bribed with the diamond not to attack Paris. There is also considerable evidence to support the belief that Brunswick sent his jewels to Caroline when his duchy was threatened by Napoleon, and that she sold them after his death. Hope and Company did indeed run into financial difficulties as a result of the war, and was sold to Barings in 1813. The recut blue diamond reappeared, briefly, in London in September 1812, exactly 20 years after its original theft, when a Huguenot lapidary, named Francillon, drew up a sales prospectus for a London diamond merchant named Daniel Eliason. Since that gentleman did not meet a violent death, and was, as far as I know, nothing like the nasty character here portrayed, I have changed his name to Daniel Eisler in making him my murder victim. What happened to the diamond after September 1812 is not known, although there is considerable evidence that it was acquired by the Prince Regent and was in his possession until his death in 1830. At that point it reappeared in the possession of Henry Philip Hope, although he always refused to divulge its origins. Numerous books have been written about the history of the Hope diamond. Arguably the most useful and current are Patch's Blue Mystery, Currin's Hope Diamond, and Fowler's Hope, Adventures of a Diamond. Blair Beresford is of my own creation. However, Thomas Hope's marriage to Louisa de la Poer Beresford was much as described here. After Hope's death, she married her cousin, William Carr Beresford, the illegitimate son of her uncle the Marquess of Waterford. A general under Wellington, he was eventually made Viscount Beresford. Interestingly, he was the commander responsible for the unauthorized, disastrous attack on the River Plate region in Argentina that played a part in Where Serpents Sleep. The Walcheren expedition and the deadly fever that resulted from it are both real. The grimoire, known as the Key of Solomon, is real. Probably written in the 14th or 15th century, it became hugely popular, although it continued to exist largely in handwritten manuscript form until late in the 19th century, when it was finally printed. There was a very real upsurge of interest in grimoires, or magic handbooks, in the 19th century. Most of those that became popular dated back to the Renaissance, for reasons Abigail McBean explains to Hero. London's vibrant Molly underground, with its accompanying dangers of extortion and prosecution, was essentially as described here, although more vibrant in the 18th century than by the early 19th. The Black Brunswickers were a real volunteer corps raised by Duke Frederick William, Princess Caroline's brother, to fight in the Napoleonic Wars after the French occupied his duchy. The life of London's crossing sweeps was, as described here, with these biographical portraits being loosely based on some of those recorded by Henry Mayhew. Mayhew's work, which appeared mid-century, also serves as the inspiration for the collection of articles Hero is writing. Some of the crossing sweeps did indeed go to the Haymarket after dark, where they played a part in supplying girls to gentlemen in carriages. The Abbey of St. Saviour in Bermondsey, Southwark, had almost entirely disappeared by the beginning of the 19th century. Besides the lay church, which still stands, all other traces vanished somewhere between 1804 and 1812. Since there is some dispute as to when, precisely, the gatehouse and its attached structures were demolished, I have taken the liberty of using them here. If you've enjoyed this book and this performance, Recorded Books recommends The Yard by Alex Grecian, narrated by Toby Leonard Moore. Victorian London is a cesspool of crime, and Scotland Yard has only 12 detectives, known as the Murder Squad, to investigate countless murders every month. Created after the Metropolitan Police's spectacular failure to capture Jack the Ripper, the Murder Squad suffers rampant public contempt. They have failed their citizens, but no one can anticipate the brutal murder of one of their own, one of the 12. When Walter Day, the squad's newest hire, is assigned the case of the murdered detective, he finds a strange ally in the Yard's first forensic pathologist, Dr. Bernard Kingsley. Together they track the killer, who clearly is not finished with the murder squad. But why? Filled with fascinating period detail and real historical figures, this spectacular debut in a new series showcases the depravity of late Victorian London and the advent of criminology. Recorded Books offers a wide selection of bestsellers, mysteries, classics, histories, and more, so visit us at recordedbooks.com to learn about our latest releases and special offers. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.